These aren't for everyone." The flight attendant's words sliced through the cabin air, sharp and deliberate, as she withheld the blanket from the shivering 12-year-old girl. Humiliated. Olivia Bennett tried to shrink into her first-class seat, wishing her father was there to shield her from the coldness that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. The attendant, Vanessa Reynolds, couldn't possibly know that Olivia's father was there in a way. From his executive office, Elijah Bennett, Senior Vice President of Global Operations for Atlantic Airlines, was watching the entire scene unfold on a live cabin feed. His daughter's text about being cold had prompted his concern, but what he witnessed was blatant discrimination against his child, and he was about to make a call directly to the cockpit. In exactly 17 minutes, Captain James Sullivan would receive a call that would change everything about Flight 2467 Atlantic Airlines corporate culture and the industry itself. Before we dive deeper into this shocking incident, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves equal treatment regardless of skin color, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to follow Olivia's incredible journey from humiliation to justice. The next part of this story will show you how a brilliant young scientist's dream trip turned into a nightmare, and why her father's position makes this case unlike any other discrimination incident you've heard before. This isn't just about a blanket, it's about dignity, power, and what happens when silent bias faces unexpected accountability. As Olivia huddled deeper into herself, the blue blankets wrapped snugly around every other first-class passenger created a stark visual of exactly who was deemed worthy of comfort and who was not. Vanessa Reynolds moved on pretending nothing unusual had occurred, but the damage was already visible in Olivia's downcast eyes. What none of them knew was that on the 47th floor of Atlantic Airlines headquarters, a father's fury was transforming into something far more powerful purpose. The countdown had begun. 2 weeks before the blanket incident, Olivia Bennett stood trembling with excitement on the stage of the National Youth Science Competition in Atlanta. The judges had just announced her climate research project as the grand prize winner among thousands of entries from across America. Her innovative approach to measuring carbon capture in urban green spaces had impressed the panel of renowned scientists who praised her methodology and insight that belied her young age. "Your work shows exceptional promise," Dr. Carlson, the lead judge, told her as she accepted the gleaming trophy. "That's why we're selecting you to represent young American scientists at the International Youth Climate Conference in Boston next month." For Olivia, this was the culmination of years of dedication. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, she'd fallen in love with environmental science after a school field trip to a local urban farm. While other kids played video games, Olivia spent weekends collecting soil samples and analyzing data. Her bedroom walls showcased scientific posters instead of pop stars, and her bookshelves overflowed with research papers she'd tracked down and studied with remarkable persistence. Elijah Bennett. Olivia's father, and a single parent since his wife died from cancer 4 years earlier, had always encouraged his daughter's scientific pursuits. As Senior Vice President of Global Operations for Atlantic Airlines, he often worked long hours and traveled frequently, but he never missed Olivia's science fairs or academic ceremonies. Their relationship had only strengthened in the wake of her mother's death, bound by grief and resilience. "I'm so proud of you, Liv," Elijah said, hugging her tight after the competition. "Your mother would have been amazed by what you've accomplished." The timing of the Boston conference, however, created a significant challenge. Elijah was overseeing a critical merger integration with SkyWest Regional that required his presence at headquarters during the exact days of the conference. After much discussion, they decided Olivia would make the trip alone her first solo flight. "I can handle it, Dad," Olivia assured him, though her voice betrayed a hint of anxiety. "I've flown with you dozens of times. I know how everything works." Elijah nodded. "I know you can. I'll arrange everything to make it as smooth as possible, and I'll fly out to join you 2 days later for your presentation." Despite her confident words, Olivia had reason to be nervous. Previous family trips had exposed her to uncomfortable stares and subtle discrimination. Once at a resort in Florida, a staff member had repeatedly asked to see her room key while ignoring white guests entering the same area. Another time, a flight attendant had questioned whether she belonged in the premium cabin despite her boarding pass clearly showing her assignment. Each time, Elijah had intervened with quiet authority, educating those involved without causing a scene. He'd taught Olivia to stand tall to know her worth wasn't diminished by others' perceptions, but he'd also shown her the reality of navigating spaces where assumptions were made about her based on the color of her skin. Now, preparing for her solo journey, Olivia reviewed her presentation materials with characteristic thoroughness. Her research on optimizing carbon capture in urban settings could help cities fight climate change more effectively. The data was solid, her methodology sound. If only the human interactions could be as reliable as scientific principles. "Just remember who you are," Elijah told her during their final preparation. "A brilliant young scientist representing the future. Nothing anyone says or does changes that." Olivia nodded, tucking his words away like a talisman against whatever might await her in the adult world she was about to navigate alone. The first time Olivia Bennett experienced discrimination firsthand, she was 8 years old. Her father had taken her to an upscale resort in Palm Beach for a long weekend, a rare vacation for the hard-working executive and his science-obsessed daughter. They'd spent the morning at the pool, Olivia practicing diving while Elijah answered urgent emails from a shaded lounge chair. When Olivia went to retrieve a towel from the cabana, the attendant stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "The resort pool is for guests only," he said, his voice artificially pleasant but his eyes cold. "I am a guest," Olivia replied, confused. "Room 512. My dad's right over there." The attendant's eyes flicked briefly toward Elijah, who was engaged in a phone call and hadn't noticed the interaction. "Do you have your room key? I'll need to see it." Olivia didn't have the key. Her father kept it, but before she could explain, a white family approached the cabana. The attendant immediately stepped aside, offering them towels without question. No key check, no verification, just immediate service with a genuine smile. It was subtle enough that Olivia couldn't quite name what had happened, but she felt it deeply, the implication that she didn't belong, that her presence required justification while others were welcomed without question. Later, when she told her father, his expression had darkened momentarily before he carefully explained what she'd experienced. "Some people make assumptions based on how we look," he'd said gently. "It's not right and it's not your fault. We can't control what others think, but we can control how we respond." The next morning, Elijah had arranged a meeting with the resort manager. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. Instead, he calmly described what had happened, pointed out the pattern, and asked what training protocols the resort had in place. By checkout, the attendant had been reassigned, and the manager had scheduled an all-staff training session. That was Elijah's way, addressing problems directly, seeking constructive solutions rather than simply reacting with anger. He'd learned through experience that measured responses often created more lasting change than emotional outbursts, especially in corporate environments where tone could be used to dismiss valid concerns. When Olivia's mother was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer, she'd witnessed this same methodical approach applied to a devastating personal crisis. Claire Bennett had been a pediatric surgeon, brilliant and compassionate, with a talent for explaining complex medical concepts in terms her daughter could understand. She'd faced her diagnosis with the same clarity she'd brought to her medical practice. "Knowledge is power," she'd told Olivia during those difficult months of treatment. "The more we understand what's happening, the better we can respond." Even as the cancer progressed, Claire had used her experience to teach Olivia about resilience. When she lost her hair to chemotherapy, she'd invited Olivia to help her shop for colorful headscarves, turning necessity into a fashion statement. When her energy flagged, She'd created research stations around their home where she could rest, while Olivia conducted simple science experiments nearby. When Claire died, Elijah had guided Olivia through grief with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything else. He'd arranged for counseling, created space for her emotions, and maintained routines that provided stability. Most importantly, he'd helped her channel her loss into purpose, encouraging her scientific interests as a connection to her mother's analytical mind and healing spirit. 4 years later, that guidance had evolved into preparing Olivia for navigating the world as a young black girl who would sometimes be treated differently based solely on appearance. He'd taught her to recognize discriminatory behaviors without internalizing them, to maintain her dignity in difficult situations, and to speak up when necessary. "Sometimes you'll be the only person who looks like you in a room," he'd explained. "People might question your presence or your abilities. Remember that their questions reflect their limitations, not yours." These lessons had served Olivia well as she excelled academically and began participating in science competitions where she was often the only black competitor. She'd developed a quiet confidence that allowed her to focus on her work despite occasional sidelong glances or surprised reactions to her accomplishments. Now, at 12, preparing for her first solo flight, Olivia carried these experiences with her not as burdens, but as knowledge that helped her understand and navigate the world. What she couldn't know was how directly these lessons would be tested at 30,000 feet above the ground, where her father's protection would be temporarily beyond reach. Teresa Rodriguez, a retired teacher and longtime family friend, volunteered to accompany Olivia to Chicago O'Hare International Airport on the morning of her flight. As they navigated the bustling terminal, Teresa kept a protective eye on Olivia, who clutched her boarding pass and conference materials with determined focus. "Remember everything your father discussed?" Teresa reminded her as they approached the Atlantic Airlines premium check-in counter. "Call him when you land, and don't hesitate to ask the flight attendants if you need anything." Olivia nodded mentally, reviewing her father's advice: arrive early, keep documents organized, remain polite but firm if questions arose. She'd packed her lucky microscope keychain, a gift from her mother on her 8th birthday, in her carry-on for extra reassurance. At the check-in counter, the agent's eyebrows rose slightly as she processed Olivia's ticket. "You're flying alone today?" she asked, glancing between Olivia and Teresa. "Yes, ma'am," Olivia replied confidently. "I'm attending the International Youth Climate Conference in Boston." The agent's expression softened. "Well, it looks like you've been upgraded to first class, Ms. Bennett. That's a pleasant surprise." Teresa smiled, unaware that Elijah had secretly arranged the upgrade as a special treat for his daughter's achievement. What neither noticed was flight attendant Vanessa Reynolds, standing nearby, observing the interaction with narrowed eyes. Vanessa, a 15-year veteran of Atlantic Airlines, had been watching as Olivia approached the premium counter. Something about the situation didn't fit her expectations: a young black girl in casual clothes at the first-class check-in. When she overheard the upgrade announcement, her lips tightened almost imperceptibly. For Vanessa, the premium cabin represented a hierarchy she had spent years enforcing. Growing up in a struggling middle-class family, she had worked her way through flight attendant training, viewing her position on premium routes as a hard-earned status symbol. Over time, she had developed rigid ideas about who belonged in first-class: executives in suits, celebrities, wealthy retirees, people whose appearance matched her conception of privilege. Anyone who didn't fit this mental image became a potential disruptor to what she considered the proper order of things. 3 years earlier, Vanessa had been passed over for a supervisory position in favor of a younger black colleague. Though the official reason cited was her colleague's superior customer feedback scores, Vanessa had convinced herself it was reverse discrimination. This perceived slight had hardened something in her, making her increasingly vigilant about maintaining what she saw as standards in her domain, the first-class cabin. As Teresa and Olivia moved toward security, Vanessa made a subtle note on her tablet. She'd be working first class on Flight 2467 to Boston, and she'd just flagged a potential situation in her mental checklist of things to monitor. Before Olivia headed to the security checkpoint, Teresa pulled her aside for some final advice. Keep to yourself, be polite, and remember that as a young black girl traveling alone, some people may treat you differently, she said quietly. Don't give anyone a reason to complain about your behavior. Olivia nodded solemnly, familiar with these warnings that were a necessary part of her upbringing. She hugged Teresa goodbye, squared her shoulders, and walked toward security with her boarding pass clutched tightly in hand, excitement and nervousness battling within her. The security screening went smoothly, though Olivia noticed the agent examined her conference invitation longer than seemed necessary. At the gate, she sat quietly reviewing her presentation on her tablet, occasionally glancing up at the growing line of business travelers in pressed suits and expensive watches. When pre-boarding was announced for first class, Olivia approached the priority lane with her ticket and passport in hand. Despite her careful preparation and the confidence Elijah had instilled in her, she felt a flutter of anxiety as other passengers, all adults, mostly white, glanced at her with varying degrees of curiosity and surprise. Vanessa Reynolds stood at the entrance to the jet bridge checking boarding passes. When Olivia presented hers, Vanessa's eyebrows shot up in a theatrical display of skepticism. "First class?" she asked, making no effort to hide her disbelief. She examined Olivia's boarding pass with unusual scrutiny, turning it over and holding it up to the light as if checking for counterfeiting. "Are you sure you're at the right gate?" "Yes, ma'am," Olivia replied politely, just as her father had taught her. She stood a little straighter, refusing to be intimidated. Vanessa looked from the boarding pass to Olivia and back again. "And this is definitely your boarding pass, not your parents'." A white businessman in line behind Olivia cleared his throat loudly. "The line's backing up," he said, checking his watch. "The kid has a first-class ticket. What's the problem?" Vanessa flashed him a customer service smile completely different from her expression toward Olivia. "Just doing my job, sir, making sure everyone's in the right place." She reluctantly handed the boarding pass back to Olivia. "Go ahead." The businessman, Thomas Wilson, gave Olivia a reassuring nod as she proceeded down the jet bridge. Vanessa's face hardened again as she turned back to Thomas. Aboard the aircraft, senior flight attendant Michael Foster was greeting passengers at the door. He smiled at Olivia, but his expression faltered when Vanessa caught his eye from the jet bridge and gave a barely perceptible headshake. "Seat 3A is on your right," Michael told Olivia. His initial warmth noticeably cooled, replaced by professional detachment. Michael had worked with Vanessa for nearly 5 years. He'd witnessed her subtle pattern of differential treatment toward certain passengers, but had always told himself it wasn't his place to intervene. As a gay man who had faced his share of discrimination, Michael recognized what was happening, but the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict with a senior colleague, had become his default. Every time he considered speaking up, he remembered the crew member who had been labeled difficult, after reporting similar behavior, subsequently finding himself assigned to less desirable routes. It was easier to look away, to pretend not to notice. Each time he did so, the barrier to speaking up grew higher. Olivia found her window seat and stored her backpack under the seat in front of her. She watched as other first-class passengers boarded, all receiving warm welcomes from the crew. Several glanced at her with surprise, but most returned to their phones or magazines after the initial curiosity. Thomas Wilson took the aisle seat next to her. "First time flying first class?" he asked kindly. "Yes, sir," Olivia answered. "I'm going to a science conference in Boston." "Really? That sounds impressive." Their conversation was interrupted when Vanessa appeared beside their row. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" she asked Olivia, ignoring Thomas completely. Olivia dutifully retrieved it from her pocket and handed it over. Vanessa studied it again, lips pursed in a show of official concern that barely masked her suspicion. "Is there a problem?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying an edge now. "Just double-checking," Vanessa said, reluctantly returning the boarding pass. "We sometimes have passengers who get confused about their seating assignments." As she walked away, Thomas muttered, "Third check for the same boarding pass. Interesting coincidence." Olivia settled into her seat, determined to enjoy the experience despite the uncomfortable start. Her father had arranged this upgrade as a special treat, and she wouldn't let anyone diminish that. As Flight 2467 taxied toward the runway, Olivia was dismayed to discover that the air vent above her seat was blasting freezing air directly onto her face and arms. She tried adjusting it, but the vent seemed stuck at full blast, creating an uncomfortable pocket of cold air around her, while the rest of the cabin remained pleasantly temperate. When Michael came by offering pre-departure beverages, Olivia politely asked, "Excuse me, could you help me adjust this air vent? I can't seem to turn it down." Michael glanced at the vent, then at Vanessa, who was watching from the galley, then back to Olivia. His thoughts churned uncomfortably. If it were any other passenger, he would have immediately helped. Instead, a split-second calculation about his own workplace comfort won out. "They're automatic climate-controlled. Nothing I can do." He moved on to the next row without offering any assistance. A flicker of shame passed through Michael as he turned away. He knew it was a lie. He'd adjusted countless air vents for passengers over the years. This small act of complicity made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling down as he continued his duties. 15 minutes later, Olivia noticed him helping an elderly white woman adjust the exact same type of vent in the row ahead. The woman thanked him profusely while Michael explained the little trick to getting it positioned just right. Olivia watched this interaction silently, processing the discrepancy but choosing not to comment. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the cabin temperature seemed unusually cold. Olivia wasn't the only one noticing. Several passengers were putting on jackets or sweaters. The difference was that most other travelers had come prepared for the notoriously chilly airplane cabins. Olivia, on her first business trip, hadn't known to bring a sweater aboard. She tried burying herself in her conference preparation, reviewing her presentation notes and research data, but the cold made it difficult to concentrate. Goosebumps had formed on her arms, and she found herself hunching her shoulders against the constant stream of cold air. When Vanessa passed by their row, Thomas spoke up. "Excuse me, could you adjust the temperature? It's freezing in here." "The temperature is standard," Vanessa replied dismissively. "Perhaps you should have brought appropriate clothing." Her eyes flicked briefly to Olivia. Throughout the meal service, Olivia noticed the stark difference in how Vanessa treated her versus other passengers. White travelers received warm smiles and attentive service, while Olivia's requests were met with curt responses or complete ignorance. When she asked for a refill of water, Vanessa pretended not to hear, though she immediately responded to similar requests from passengers across the aisle. Michael observed these interactions with growing discomfort. Each time he witnessed Vanessa's differential treatment, the knot in his stomach tightened. He found himself avoiding eye contact with Olivia, afraid to see the quiet hurt in her expression, a hurt that would force him to acknowledge his own role in allowing this situation to continue. Once he made eye contact with Olivia as Vanessa walked away after ignoring another of her polite requests, but he quickly looked away, busying himself with paperwork in the galley. The shame was becoming harder to ignore. He thought about his partner Marcus, who frequently challenged him to speak up when he witnessed injustice, reminding him of a time when others had stood silent during his own experiences with discrimination. "If not now, when?" Marcus had asked him just that morning when Michael had mentioned an incident on a previous flight. "If not you, who?" The questions echoed in his mind as he continued his duties, each moment of inaction weighing heavier than the last. During a moment of turbulence when Vanessa was in the back of the cabin, Olivia pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her father. "Flight really cold. Forgot jacket. Otherwise okay." She downplayed the situation, not wanting to worry him or sound like she was complaining. Olivia was used to handling difficult situations on her own, especially when her father was busy with work. Thomas's expression grew increasingly stormy as he witnessed Olivia's treatment. "This is ridiculous." he muttered after Vanessa bypassed Olivia during a snack service. "I've flown this airline hundreds of times and I've never seen service this poor or this biased." Olivia just shook her head slightly, not wanting to draw more attention or create conflict. She'd been raised to keep her head down and not make waves, especially in situations where, as her father often sadly explained, people had already made up their minds about her based solely on the color of her skin. "You don't have to put up with this," Thomas said quietly. "I can speak to the purser if you'd like." "It's okay," Olivia whispered. "I don't want to cause trouble." Thomas looked like he wanted to say more but respected her wishes and returned to his magazine, though he continued to observe the flight attendant's behavior with increasing concern. As evening deepened into night, the Boston-bound flight continued its journey across the darkened landscape below. The cabin lights dimmed after the meal service was completed, signaling to passengers that it was time to rest. Many travelers reclined their seats and closed their eyes, preparing to catch some sleep before landing. The temperature in this cabin had not improved. If anything, it seemed to have dropped further as the night progressed. Olivia sat huddled in her seat arms, wrapped tightly around herself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. The persistent cold air blowing directly on her made concentration impossible, and she'd given up trying to review her conference notes. Across the aisle, an elderly woman named Elizabeth Parker noticed Olivia's discomfort. She frowned slightly but said nothing, instead watching how the flight attendants interacted with the young girl. As a retired civil rights attorney, Elizabeth had spent decades recognizing patterns of discrimination, and what she observed now was setting off familiar alarms in her mind. Next to Elizabeth sat a middle-aged couple who had also been watching the situation unfold. They exchanged whispers, occasionally glancing at Olivia with expressions of concern. The husband seemed to be urging his wife to say something, but she hesitated, uncomfortable with confrontation. For Olivia, the flight was becoming an endurance test. She'd experienced subtle discrimination before, but always with her father nearby to address it. Now, alone at 30,000 feet, she was discovering the full weight of navigating bias without protection. Each ignored request, each disparate treatment reinforced the message that she didn't belong in this premium cabin, that the comfort afforded to others wasn't meant for her. Despite the discomfort, Olivia maintained the dignity her parents had instilled in her. She didn't complain loudly, didn't create a scene, but inside questions churned. Would this be how the conference went too? Would she constantly need to prove her right to be in spaces where she'd earned her place? And how many other brilliant minds had turned away from opportunities because of these constant grinding reminders of exclusion? Vanessa emerged from the galley, pushing a cart loaded with blankets and pillows. The soft blue Atlantic Airlines blankets were neatly folded in stacks, along with white pillows and plastic wrapping. First-class passengers perked up at the sight, eager for the additional comfort items that would help them sleep during the overnight flight. Row by row, Vanessa distributed the bedding with practiced efficiency and a professional smile to almost everyone. She handed pillows and blankets to passengers in rows 1A and 1B, then 2A and 2B. Then deliberately, she skipped over 3A, where Olivia sat, moving directly to Thomas in 3B, before continuing to rows 4 and beyond. Thomas immediately noticed the omission. He watched as Vanessa gave the last visible blanket to the passenger seated directly behind Olivia, then began to fold up her cart. The deliberate nature of the skip was impossible to miss. Every single passenger in first class now had a blanket, except for the young black girl who was visibly cold. Olivia, who had been watching the distribution with growing hope, finally spoke up in a small, polite voice. "Excuse me, could I please have a blanket too? I'm really cold." The cabin fell momentarily quiet as several nearby passengers looked up, apparently noticing for the first time that the young black girl had been skipped. Even those who hadn't been paying attention could see the stark visual disparity, a cabin full of passengers wrapped in identical blue blankets with a single child left without. Vanessa turned slowly, her customer service smile nowhere in evidence. In a voice loud enough to be heard several rows away, she stated coldly, "These aren't for everyone." The blunt declaration hung in the air. Elizabeth Parker across the aisle gasped audibly. Thomas Wilson's mouth fell open in shock. A woman in row 4 looked up from her book, startled by the naked hostility in those 4 words. For Vanessa, the moment triggered something deeper than conscious thought, a lifetime of perceived slights and insecurities about her own status. In her mind, maintaining the standards of first class had become intertwined with her sense of self-worth. When challenged about the blanket, what surfaced wasn't reasoned judgment, but an emotional defense of territory she saw as hers to control. The words had escaped before she could censor them, revealing a bias that usually remained beneath a veneer of professionalism. Olivia's cheeks burned with humiliation as she shrank back into her seat, trying to become invisible. She'd faced subtle bias before the extended scrutiny of her boarding pass, the ignored requests, the mysteriously unfixable air vent. But this was overt, undeniable, and public. There was no ambiguity to soften the blow, no way to tell herself she might be imagining things. Thomas Dixon was not so easily silenced. "What do you mean, not for everyone?" he demanded, unbuckling his seatbelt and standing up. "You just gave blankets to literally every other passenger in first class." Vanessa's expression hardened. "Sir, please remain seated while the seatbelt sign is illuminated." "I'll sit down when you explain why this child isn't getting a blanket when everyone else did," Thomas countered, though he did lower himself back into his seat. Michael Foster, who had been observing from the galley, felt the situation spiraling beyond the realm of plausible deniability. Each moment he remained silent now felt like active participation in something he knew was wrong. His heart raced as he approached, torn between workplace self-preservation and the moral clarity that was becoming impossible to ignore. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice professionally neutral but his conscience screaming. "Yes, there's a problem," Thomas said before Vanessa could respond. "Your colleague here just deliberately skipped giving a blanket to this young girl, then told her they aren't for everyone. I want to know what Atlantic Airlines policy states about blanket distribution, because it seems suspiciously like racial discrimination from where I'm sitting." Several passengers murmured in agreement. The middle-aged couple exchanged glances. Elizabeth Parker set aside her book, her full attention now on the unfolding situation. Michael looked uncomfortable, his professional mask cracking as the magnitude of the moment pressed in on him. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. We have limited supplies on board." "That's simply not true," interrupted Elizabeth Parker from across the aisle. "I fly this route twice a month, and there are always more than enough blankets for first class. Always." Michael's professional demeanor faltered momentarily as he glanced toward the galley where he had earlier noticed at least 6 additional blankets stored in a compartment. His career flashed before his eyes, the mortgage he and Marcus had just taken out, the promotion he was hoping for, the potential fallout if he contradicted a senior colleague. But underneath those practical concerns, a deeper question surfaced. How would he live with himself if he continued to be complicit? Vanessa cut in. "We are following standard procedures for this flight. If you continue to be disruptive, sir, I'll have to report this incident to the captain." Olivia, mortified by the attention and conflict she had inadvertently caused, spoke up in a quiet voice. "It's okay. I don't need a blanket. Please don't worry about it." Elizabeth Parker wouldn't let it go. "This isn't right," she said firmly. She began to remove her own blanket. "Here, dear, you can share mine. I don't need the whole thing." Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "Ma'am, blankets are assigned to specific seat numbers for inventory purposes. Sharing isn't permitted under our current COVID protocols." This was clearly a fabrication, and several passengers exchanged knowing glances. No such policy had ever been mentioned on any Atlantic flight before. "That's ridiculous," Elizabeth replied, but hesitated with the blanket half removed. Olivia shook her head quickly. "Thank you, but please keep your blanket. I'm fine, really." Thomas, fuming silently, removed his sports jacket and handed it to Olivia. "Here. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "Sir, interfering with another passenger's comfort," Vanessa began. Is giving my own jacket to a freezing child against Atlantic Airlines policy? Thomas challenged. Please go ahead. I'd love to explain to the captain exactly what's been happening on this flight. Vanessa's lips thinned to a tight line. I'll be documenting your disruptive behavior, she said, before turning on her heel and retreating to the galley where she began a whispered conversation with Michael. In the galley, Michael felt trapped between conflicting loyalties. Vanessa, I think we need to get her a blanket, he whispered urgently. This is getting out of hand. Stay out of it, Vanessa hissed. We can't let passengers dictate how we do our jobs. Once we give in on one thing, they'll question everything. You know how it works. Michael hesitated, his desire to avoid conflict warring with his growing certainty that what was happening was simply wrong. But there are plenty of blankets. I saw them myself when I was restocking earlier. Vanessa's eyes narrowed dangerously. Whose side are you on, Michael? Remember what happened to Craig when he started questioning senior crew decisions. The implied threat was clear. Craig had been transferred to regional routes after filing a complaint about another flight attendant. It was a career setback from which he had never fully recovered. Olivia accepted Thomas's jacket with a whispered, "Thank you," draping it across her shoulders. Despite the additional layer, she couldn't stop shivering, partly from cold, but now also from the stress and humiliation of the situation. She kept her head down, allowing her hair to fall forward and shield her face as tears welled up in her eyes. She had faced subtle discrimination before, but never something this blatant, this public, never something that made her feel so unwelcome, so unwanted, so obviously different. In that moment, all her accomplishments, the science prize, the invitation to the prestigious conference, her years of hard work seemed to shrink in comparison to the single immutable fact of her skin color. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another falling silently onto Thomas's jacket. She wished desperately for her father, for his calm strength and quiet wisdom in the face of injustice. But he was miles away, unaware of what his daughter was enduring, or so she thought. As the tension in the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Elizabeth Parker unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way across the aisle to Olivia's row. At 75, with silver hair styled in a neat bob and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "Young lady," she said softly to Olivia, "my name is Elizabeth Parker. I'm a retired civil rights attorney, and what just happened to you was completely unacceptable." Olivia looked up quickly, wiping away tears. "It's okay, really. I don't want to cause trouble." Elizabeth's expression softened. "Standing up for your dignity isn't causing trouble. It's your right." She turned to Thomas. "Thank you for speaking up, sir. Too often people witness discrimination and say nothing." "Thomas Wilson," he introduced himself with a nod. "And I've never seen anything quite this blatant on a commercial flight." From row 4, a woman leaned forward. "I've been recording since the blanket was denied," she said quietly, holding up her phone. "Just in case you need documentation." Vanessa, returning from the galley, spotted the phone and immediately tensed. "Ma'am, recording flight crew is against airline policy. I'll need you to delete that immediately." "Actually," Elizabeth interjected, "there's no federal regulation prohibiting passengers from recording incidents on aircraft unless it interferes with crew duties. This clearly doesn't." Vanessa's face flushed with anger. "You're not familiar with Atlantic Airlines' specific policies. I review airline policies professionally as part of my work with the Air Passenger Rights Association," Elizabeth replied calmly. "Unless there's been a very recent change, I'm quite familiar with Atlantic's passenger guidelines." Thomas looked at Elizabeth with newfound respect, while Olivia watched the exchange with wide eyes. The woman in row 4 continued recording, though more discreetly now. Vanessa, realizing she was outmatched, changed tactics. "I'll need to inform the captain about this disruption," she said, retreating once more toward the galley. "Please do," Elizabeth called after her. "I think Captain Sullivan would be very interested in learning about discriminatory service in his cabin." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You know the captain." "I know many of the pilots on this route," Elizabeth explained. "I've been commuting between Chicago and Boston twice monthly for years. James Sullivan is one of their most experienced captains." A middle-aged man from row 2 approached their growing congregation. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Dr. Richard Hoffman, and I believe I saw more blankets in the overhead bin near the galley. They're clearly trying to hide the fact that they have adequate supplies." Olivia, still huddled in Thomas's jacket, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. "Please, everyone, it's just a blanket. I don't want to make this into a big deal." Elizabeth sat in the empty seat across the aisle, angling to face Olivia. "Sweetheart, it's not just a blanket. It's about being treated with the same respect and dignity as everyone else. If we don't speak up about the small injustices, the big ones become normalized." By now, about half the first-class cabin was engaged in quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed. A businessman typing on his laptop paused to explain the situation to his seatmate who had been sleeping. An older couple whispered while glancing repeatedly toward Olivia, their expressions concerned. Michael Foster returned from the cockpit, his professional demeanor strained by visible discomfort. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. We're experiencing some turbulence ahead, and the captain will be turning on the seatbelt sign shortly." "There's no turbulence," Thomas noted, glancing out the window at the perfectly clear night sky. "That's an excuse to break up this conversation." Michael avoided eye contact. "I'm just relaying the captain's instructions, sir." As passengers reluctantly returned to their seats, Michael found himself at a crossroads. The conversation in the cockpit had not gone as Vanessa had hoped. Captain Sullivan had asked pointed questions about the blanket distribution that Michael had struggled to answer honestly without directly implicating his colleague. Now, back in the cabin, he stood frozen in indecision, watching as a situation he could have prevented spiraled further out of control. In the galley, he abruptly made a decision. Opening a storage compartment, he retrieved one of the remaining blankets still wrapped in plastic. Vanessa was occupied taking drink orders at the rear of the cabin. This was his moment to act. Michael approached Olivia's seat, blanket in hand. He knelt beside her, speaking quietly. "I apologize for not bringing this sooner," he said, offering her the blanket. "There was never a shortage." Olivia looked at him with surprise, then understanding. "Thank you," she said softly. As Michael stood to return to his duties, he caught Thomas's eye. The businessman gave him a slight nod of acknowledgement, not absolution, but recognition of a step in the right direction. Vanessa, returning to the forward cabin, stopped cold when she saw Olivia, now wrapped in an Atlantic Airlines blanket, identical to those provided to other passengers. Her eyes narrowed as they found Michael. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but sharp with fury. "Now." In the galley away from passenger ears, Vanessa confronted Michael. "What do you think you're doing, undermining my authority, making me look like a liar?" Michael met her gaze directly, for perhaps the first time in their years of working together. "I'm doing my job, Vanessa, providing equal service to all passengers." "You've crossed a line," she hissed. "This won't be forgotten." "Neither will what happened to that child," Michael replied, surprised by his own steadiness. "I should have intervened sooner. That's on me." As Michael returned to his duties, he felt a weight lifting the burden of complicity he'd carried for too long. There would be consequences professionally and personally, but for the first time in years, he felt aligned with his own values. The price of silence had finally become too high to pay. Elizabeth Parker, watching this exchange from her seat, nodded to herself in recognition of what had transpired. She'd seen this pattern countless times in her decades of civil rights work, the moment when a bystander finally chooses a side, understanding that neutrality in the face of discrimination is itself a form of support for the status quo. For Olivia, wrapped now in the blanket that should have been hers all along, the experience remained profoundly unsettling. The warmth of the blanket couldn't entirely dispel the chill of being singled out, of being deemed unworthy of the same comfort freely given to others. But something else was emerging alongside the hurt, a growing awareness of allies who had chosen to stand with her rather than remain silent witnesses. As the flight continued eastward through the darkness, what had begun as an isolated incident of discrimination had transformed into something else, a microcosm of how bias operates, how it is maintained through silence and complicity, and how it can be challenged through individual and collective action. It was a lesson Olivia had not expected to learn at 30,000 feet, but one that would shape her understanding of justice long after this flight had landed. As the impromptu community of allies settled back into their seats, Olivia found herself caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. On the surface, she maintained the composed demeanor her father had taught her, back straight, voice steady, emotions controlled. But beneath that careful exterior turmoil raged. Humiliation burned through her chest like acid. Despite her achievements, winning the national competition, being selected to present at an international conference, years of dedication to her research, she'd been reduced to the black girl who didn't deserve a blanket. The stark visual contrast of being the only passenger without this basic comfort item had painted her as an outsider for everyone to see. "Why did it have to be me?" she thought, clutching Thomas's jacket around her shoulders, even though she now had a blanket. "Why does it always have to be us?" Anger simmered too, not just at Vanessa's overt hostility, but at Michael's initial complicity through inaction. He'd seen what was happening and chosen the path of least resistance, preserving workplace harmony at the expense of a child's dignity. Olivia recognized this pattern from previous experiences, the silent bystanders who weren't actively discriminating, but whose silence enabled it to continue. There was fear as well. The conference loomed ahead, filled with potential for similar situations. Would she face the same scrutiny and dismissal from scientists and academics? Would her research be taken seriously, or would she constantly need to prove her right to be in spaces where she'd earned her place through merit? Part of her wanted to call her father right now to hear his reassuring voice telling her how to navigate this situation. But another part, the part that yearned to be self-sufficient to handle challenges independently, resisted. How would she ever grow stronger if she immediately reached for her father's protection at the first sign of trouble? Thomas's jacket lay across her shoulders beneath the blanket, a kind gesture that nonetheless highlighted her vulnerability. The passenger's intervention, while well-intentioned, had transformed a private humiliation into a public spectacle. Now everyone was watching, discussing, forming opinions about an incident where she'd never wanted to be the center of attention. "I'm supposed to be presenting groundbreaking climate research," she thought with a flicker of resentment, not becoming a case study in racial discrimination. A memory surfaced, her mother in the hospital, dignity intact, despite the indignities of illness. "How you face difficulty shapes who you become," Claire had told her during those final weeks. "You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond." Olivia wondered what her mother would advise now. Claire had been unfailingly kind, but never passive in the face of injustice. She'd found ways to address wrongs without sacrificing her professional standing or personal grace. A tear slipped down Olivia's cheek as she stared out the darkened window. She wiped it away quickly, not wanting anyone to notice. The reflection that looked back at her from the glass seemed younger than 12, smaller than she felt most days when immersed in her research or planning her presentation. The text she'd sent her father now seemed inadequate. "Flight really cold, forgot jacket. Otherwise okay." She'd downplayed the situation out of habit, not wanting to worry him, not wanting to sound like she was complaining, not wanting to be a burden when he was handling important business matters. But what if she'd been honest? What if she'd written, "The flight attendant is treating me differently from everyone else. She's giving blankets to all the white passengers, but told me they're not for everyone. I'm cold and embarrassed and trying to remember what you taught me about dignity." Would that have been weakness or strength? Her father always emphasized the importance of naming problems clearly before they could be addressed. Yet he also taught her to pick her battles wisely to conserve emotional energy for things that truly mattered. I hate this, she thought suddenly, the admission taking her by surprise. I hate that my skin color matters more than my brain to some people. I hate that I can't just be a scientist without also being a black girl scientist. I hate that I have to be twice as good to get half the respect. The intensity of this feeling startled her. Normally, she channeled such emotions into her work, using them as fuel for her ambitions. But right now, wrapped in a blanket that had become a symbol of grudging inclusion rather than genuine welcome, she just felt tired. Tired of navigating other people's assumptions. Tired of having to constantly prove her right to exist in spaces she had earned through merit. Elizabeth Parker's words echoed in her mind. Standing up for your dignity isn't causing trouble. It's your right. Those words resonated with something deep inside Olivia, something that recognized their truth even as years of cautious navigation made her hesitant to embrace them fully. She thought about the young girls who would attend her presentation, especially the black and brown girls who might see in her an example of what they could achieve. What would they think if they knew she'd accepted being singled out and denied something given to everyone else? What message would that send about their own worth and what treatment they should accept? A fresh wave of confusion hit her. Was this incident worth all this attention? It was just a blanket after all. But even as she thought this, she knew it wasn't about the blanket. It was about the message behind the denial. The message that said, "You don't belong here," that whispered, "These comforts aren't meant for people like you." Olivia straightened in her seat, adjusting Thomas's jacket around her shoulders. The science conference was important. Her research on urban carbon capture could help cities fight climate change more effectively. But this moment mattered too, this small stand for dignity in a world that too often tried to diminish it. Her father had always told her that change rarely came from grand gestures, but from steady, principled actions in ordinary moments. Perhaps this was one of those moments not just about a blanket, but about the cumulative impact of countless small indignities and the courage to say enough. As the flight continued eastward through the darkness, Olivia made a decision. She would document what had happened not for revenge, but for truth. She would speak about it clearly and factually to her father, not diminishing the impact, but also not allowing it to overshadow her purpose in traveling to Boston. And at the conference she would stand tall, present her research with confidence, and be fully herself, not despite what had happened on this flight, but partly because of it. The lessons of this night would become part of her story, not a defining trauma, but a formative experience in learning to navigate spaces that weren't designed with her in mind, to claim her place with quiet determination, and to recognize the power of allies who stood up when witnessing injustice. With that resolution, Olivia turned back to her tablet, reviewing her presentation once more. The temperature in the cabin had improved somewhat, though she was still noticeably colder than she'd like to be. But something had shifted internally, a strengthening of resolve that had nothing to do with physical comfort and everything to do with self-worth. What Olivia couldn't know was that 30,000 feet below her father was already setting in motion events that would transform this personal indignity into a catalyst for structural change. Elijah Bennett sat alone in his expansive executive office on the 47th floor of Atlantic Airline's global headquarters in Chicago. The clock on his wall showed 11:42 p.m., but his day was far from over. Spread across his desk were documents related to the airline's merger with Sky West Regional, a strategic acquisition that would strengthen Atlantic's domestic network and provide critical feeder traffic to international routes. The merger had consumed Elijah's attention for weeks, requiring late nights and early mornings. As Senior Vice President of Global Operations, his approval was needed on countless integration plans, affecting everything from route structures to maintenance protocols. Tonight, an unexpected issue with pilot seniority list integration had kept him working hours past his intended departure time. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Elijah glanced at it, expecting another update from the legal team working on the merger. Instead, he saw Olivia's name. The message had actually arrived 3 hours earlier, but in the crush of work demands he hadn't noticed. Flight really cold. Forgot jacket. Otherwise okay. Elijah frowned slightly. Olivia wasn't one to complain about minor discomforts. For her to mention the temperature, it must be unusually cold. He checked the flight status on his computer and saw that Atlantic 2467 was currently over Pennsylvania, scheduled to land in Boston in approximately 2 hours. Concerned Elijah picked up his desk phone and dialed the airline's operations control center. "This is Elijah Bennett. Can you check the cabin temperature setting on Atlantic 2467 to Boston?" "Yes, sir," replied the operations controller, after a brief pause. "System shows cabin temperature is set at 68 degrees, which is within normal parameters. What about the specific temperature reading in first class?" Another pause. "First class reading shows 65 degrees, which is slightly below target, but still within acceptable range." Elijah's frown deepened. If the cabin was 65 degrees, Olivia shouldn't be uncomfortable enough to text about it, especially in first class, where the temperature was typically kept slightly warmer than the main cabin. "What about the blanket count for that flight? Do we have enough on board?" The controller checked the manifest. Flight was loaded with 12 first-class blankets for 8 first-class seats plus 120 economy blankets, more than sufficient for a full flight. Now Elijah was genuinely puzzled. With plenty of blankets available, why would Olivia be cold enough to mention it? A memory flashed through his mind. Olivia, at age 8, returning from a flight with her mother, talking about a flight attendant who had been extra nice to the other kids. It had taken gentle questioning to reveal that Olivia had been the only child not offered a treat from the snack basket. Elijah's parental instinct, honed by years as a single father, sensed something wasn't right. "I need to see what's happening on that aircraft," he said decisively. "Activate the cabin monitoring system for Atlantic 2467. "Sir." The controller sounded surprised. The cabin monitoring system, a network of security cameras installed throughout the aircraft, was typically only accessed during security incidents or hijacking situations. "You heard me," Elijah said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had helped him rise through the corporate ranks. "This is a level 1 priority. Send the video feed directly to my office terminal." "Yes, sir. Authentication code required." Elijah provided his executive override code, and moments later his computer screen displayed multiple views of the cabin interior on Atlantic 2467. The lighting was dimmed for the overnight flight, but the high-definition cameras captured the scene clearly enough. Elijah scanned the first-class cabin, quickly locating Olivia in seat 3A. What he saw made his blood run cold. His daughter sat huddled against the window, a man's jacket draped around her shoulders, visibly shivering. Every other passenger in the first-class cabin was comfortably wrapped in the airline's blue blankets. The disparity was striking and unmistakable. As Elijah watched, a flight attendant passed through the cabin, deliberately averting her eyes from Olivia while cheerfully checking on the comfort of other passengers. The woman's name tag was clearly visible: Vanessa Reynolds. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. As a black executive in a predominantly white industry, he had developed an almost superhuman control over his emotions learned through years of being the only person of color in high-level meetings. That hard-won composure was now being tested to its limits. He continued watching, taking in more details. An elderly white woman was speaking to Olivia from across the aisle, her body language suggesting support rather than hostility. A businessman in the seat next to Olivia, apparently the owner of the jacket she was wearing, seemed to be advocating for her. Other passengers were engaged, some recording on phones, others in animated conversation with the flight attendants. This wasn't just a simple oversight or service failure. This was a scenario Elijah had seen too many times before: the singling out of his daughter based on race, the deliberate withholding of something freely given to others, the message that she didn't belong in a premium space, regardless of her ticket or achievements. He picked up his phone again and made a series of rapid-fire calls. First, to Jeffrey Patterson, Atlantic's chief legal counsel, apologizing for the late hour, but insisting on immediate legal consultation. Jeff, I'm observing what appears to be a clear case of racial discrimination against a minor on one of our flights. I need to know our liability position and immediate remediation options. Next to Alexandra Rodriguez, chairwoman of the board. Alexandra, we have a situation developing that could seriously impact our diversity commitments and public image. I'm handling it personally, but wanted you aware before it potentially becomes public. Then to Sarah Williams, regional manager for New England operations. Sarah, I need you to meet Atlantic 2467 when it lands in Boston. There's a serious customer service failure in progress that requires immediate executive presence. Finally, Elijah made the most unusual call of all, directly to the aircraft itself. Few people outside the airline industry realized that all commercial aircraft are equipped with satellite phones, allowing ground personnel to contact the cockpit in flight. As an executive, Elijah had the authority to initiate such communication, though it was rarely done except in emergencies. Connect me to the flight deck of Atlantic 2467, he instructed the communications officer. As he waited for the connection, Elijah took a deep breath, centering himself. His corporate training urged caution procedure documentation. His fatherly instinct demanded immediate intervention. He needed to find the balance to address the injustice his daughter was facing without creating additional complications for her or the airline. Just as the call was connecting, Elijah's office door opened. Richard Dalton, executive vice president, and his direct superior entered without knocking. Bennett, what's this I hear about you activating the cabin monitoring system? Do you know how many protocols that breaks? Elijah's jaw tightened. Richard, my daughter is on that flight and appears to be experiencing discrimination. I'm addressing it. Dalton's expression hardened. You can't use company resources for personal matters. Deactivate that feed now. I'm afraid I can't do that. Elijah's voice was calm but firm. This isn't just personal. It's a serious service failure that could create significant liability for the airline. That's for customer relations to handle through proper channels, Dalton insisted. Not for you to hijack operational systems because your kid's involved. The satellite phone clicked as the connection was established. In exactly 17 minutes since Elijah had first noticed Olivia's text, the trajectory of Atlantic Airlines was about to change course with or without Richard Dalton's approval. Atlantic 2467, Captain Sullivan speaking. Elijah met Dalton's challenging stare as he responded. Captain Sullivan, this is Elijah Bennett, Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Atlantic Airlines headquarters. Dalton's eyes widened in disbelief as Elijah continued the call, effectively forcing his superior to either make a public scene or back down. After a moment's hesitation, Dalton chose the latter, silently taking a seat across from Elijah's desk to monitor the situation. The line had been drawn. Elijah was choosing justice for his daughter over corporate hierarchy, a decision that could cost him professionally, but which he made without hesitation. The countdown that had begun 17 minutes earlier was reaching its conclusion, setting in motion changes that would reach far beyond one flight or one blanket. Atlantic 2467, Captain Sullivan speaking. Elijah gripped the phone tightly, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface and Richard Dalton's disapproving presence across the desk. Captain Sullivan, this is Elijah Bennett, Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Atlantic Airlines headquarters. There was a brief pause. Yes, sir. How can I help you? The pilot's voice was professional but clearly surprised by the unusual direct contact. Captain, I have reason to believe there's a serious situation developing in your first-class cabin involving discriminatory treatment of a minor passenger. Elijah kept his tone measured, focusing on facts rather than accusations. Can you elaborate, sir? Sullivan asked, his tone shifting from surprised to concerned. The passenger in question is my daughter Olivia Bennett, seated in 3A. Elijah heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I've accessed the cabin monitoring system and observed that she appears to be the only passenger in first class denied a blanket. She's visibly cold and distressed. Other passengers appear to be attempting to assist her, which suggests they've also noticed differential treatment." Captain Sullivan listened with growing concern. As aircraft commander, he was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his flight, including the actions of his cabin crew. Discrimination of any kind violated not only company policy, but his personal code of ethics. "I understand, sir. I'll investigate immediately. May I ask if you've had any direct communication with your daughter about this situation?" "A text message reporting she was very cold, which prompted my investigation. She downplayed the situation, which is typical of her. Olivia isn't one to complain." Sullivan made a quick decision. "Mr. Bennett, I'll personally look into this right now. I'll report back within 15 minutes. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your prompt attention." As Elijah hung up, Richard Dalton leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "You're overstepping, Bennett. This could have serious repercussions for your career." Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I'm aware of that possibility. The board won't look kindly on an executive who uses his position to intervene in personal matters." "I disagree with your characterization," Elijah replied calmly. "If any passenger were experiencing discriminatory treatment on one of our flights, it would be my responsibility to address it. The fact that this passenger happens to be my daughter doesn't change that professional obligation." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You've bypassed multiple levels of proper procedure. At minimum, you should have notified me before taking action." "Given the time-sensitive nature of the situation, immediate action was required," Elijah countered. "However, I've already contacted legal, the board chair, and regional operations, all appropriate parties for an incident of this nature. Except your direct supervisor," Dalton pointed out sharply. "A regrettable oversight in the urgency of the moment," Elijah acknowledged, though they both knew it had been a deliberate choice. Dalton's reputation for prioritizing shareholder value and operational efficiency over employee welfare and passenger experience was well established. Elijah had calculated that seeking permission would have resulted in unnecessary delays. "You're walking a very thin line, Bennett," Dalton warned. "The merger is at a critical stage. We can't afford distractions." "I would argue that we can't afford to ignore discrimination on our aircraft, particularly against a minor," Elijah responded. "The potential legal and reputational damage from inaction far exceeds any momentary distraction." Their conversation was interrupted by Elijah's phone. Jackson Thomas, CEO of Atlantic Airlines, was calling. "I should take this," Elijah said, not asking permission. Dalton stood his expression tight with suppressed anger. "This isn't over, Bennett. We'll discuss the appropriate disciplinary actions once this situation is resolved." As Dalton exited, Elijah answered the call. "Jackson, thank you for calling back so quickly. I just got off the phone with Alexandra. She says you've identified a discrimination incident on one of our flights involving your daughter." "That's correct." Elijah summarized what he had observed and the actions he had taken. "And Richard Dalton, has he been briefed?" "He's aware of the situation," Elijah replied carefully. "He has some concerns about procedure." "I imagine he does," Thomas responded dryly. "Look, Elijah, I understand your position as a father, but Richard has a point about following proper channels. This creates a complicated precedent." "I appreciate that perspective," Elijah said, his voice betraying no emotion. "And if there were time for committee reviews and approval chains, I would have followed them. But discrimination happening in real time requires immediate intervention." There was a pause on the line, then a sigh. "You're putting me in a difficult position. How do I explain to other executives that they can't intervene when their family members have service complaints, but you can?" "With respect, Jackson, this isn't about a missing meal option or a delayed flight. This is about a child being singled out based on her race. I'd hope any executive would take similar action if they witnessed discrimination in progress regardless of who the passenger was. Another pause longer this time. Very well. You have my provisional support pending the outcome of Captain Sullivan's investigation. If he confirms discriminatory behavior, I'll back your decision to divert if necessary. If not, the implication hung in the air. If Sullivan found no evidence of discrimination, Elijah's position within the company would become precarious indeed. I understand, Elijah said simply. As the call ended, Elijah turned back to his computer where the cabin feed was still active. The stakes had just increased exponentially. It wasn't just his daughter's comfort at risk now, but his own career, the position he had spent decades building, the influence that allowed him to advocate for change from within the financial security that had given Olivia opportunities he himself had never had growing up. Yet as he watched his daughter sitting alone wrapped in a stranger's jacket, while everyone around her enjoyed airline-provided blankets, he knew he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Some principles transcended career considerations. Some moments required taking a stand regardless of the personal cost. Elijah's phone rang, Captain Sullivan calling back as promised. Mr. Bennett, I've investigated the situation personally. Sullivan reported, his voice grave. I can confirm that your daughter was indeed inappropriately denied standard first-class service items. I've personally delivered a blanket to her and arranged for a hot beverage. More importantly, I've identified what appears to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior from one of our flight attendants. Thank you, Captain. What actions are you taking? Based on what I've observed and statements from crew members, I believe the appropriate course of action is to divert to Cleveland Hopkins International and remove the flight attendant in question from duty pending a full investigation. There was a moment of silence before Elijah responded. The executive in him calculated costs, the operational disruption, compensation for delayed passengers, crew replacement logistics, potential union grievance. The father in him thought only of Olivia humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers. I appreciate your decisive action, Captain. I agree with your assessment. We'll divert to Cleveland. I'll coordinate with operations for a replacement crew member to minimize further delay to Boston. Understood. I'll have our ground team standing by in Cleveland. Sullivan paused briefly. And, sir. Yes, Captain. Thank you for doing the right thing. As Elijah ended the call, exactly 17 minutes had passed since he'd first noticed Olivia's text. In that time, he had set in motion actions that would affect hundreds of people immediately and potentially transform airline policy for years to come. The merger documents still lay scattered across his desk, momentarily forgotten in the face of a more fundamental priority, ensuring that his daughter, and by extension all passengers, received the dignity and respect they deserved. The countdown had reached 0. The transformation of Atlantic Airlines had begun, and so had the clock on Elijah's own professional future. When Richard Dalton returned, and Elijah knew he would, with formal complaints about procedure violations and chain-of-command breaches, Elijah would face a reckoning. The question was whether the end result would justify the career risk he had just taken. For Olivia, the answer was unquestionably yes. Captain James Sullivan had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. Before joining Atlantic Airlines, he had served 12 years in the Air Force, piloting everything from training aircraft to massive C-17 Globemaster transport planes during multiple combat deployments. Few situations in civilian aviation could rattle his composure. The satellite phone ringing in the cockpit at cruising altitude wasn't unheard of, but it was unusual enough to raise his eyebrows. James exchanged a quick glance with First Officer Kevin Martinez before reaching for the handset. "This is Captain Sullivan on Atlantic 2467. He answered crisply, automatically checking his instruments as he spoke. His first thought was potential weather issues or an air traffic control directive requiring a route change. "Captain Sullivan, this is Elijah Bennett, Senior Vice President of Global Operations at Atlantic Airlines Headquarters." James straightened in his seat. Executives at Bennett's level didn't make casual calls to in-flight cockpits. His mind rapidly assessed possible scenarios: major security alert, operational emergency, or some high-value passenger requiring special handling. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "I have reason to believe there's a serious situation developing in your first-class cabin involving discriminatory treatment of a minor passenger." Not what James had expected. He frowned, thinking of the cabin crew he'd worked with for years. Michael Foster was a seasoned professional, and while Vanessa Reynolds was known for being strictly by the book, her record had been clean as far as he knew. "Can you elaborate, sir?" "The passenger in question is my daughter Olivia Bennett, seated in 3A. James felt a jolt of surprise. He'd had no idea the SVP of Global Operations had family aboard his aircraft. The manifest would have shown the Bennett name, but there was no flag in the system indicating any relationship to executive leadership. Elijah continued, his voice controlled but with an underlying intensity that James recognized from his own military days, the sound of someone working very hard to maintain professional composure under extreme stress. "I've accessed the cabin monitoring system and observed that my daughter appears to be the only passenger in first class denied a blanket. She's visibly cold and distressed. Other passengers appear to be attempting to assist her, which suggests they've also noticed differential treatment." James listened with growing concern. As aircraft commander, he was ultimately responsible for everything that happened on his flight, including the actions of his cabin crew. Discrimination of any kind violated not only company policy, but his personal code of ethics. The Air Force had taught him that leadership meant protecting those under his command, regardless of rank or background. It was a principle he'd carried into his civilian career, viewing passengers not as customers, but as individuals entrusted to his care. If discrimination was occurring on his aircraft, it wasn't just a service failure, it was a betrayal of that fundamental responsibility. "I understand, sir. I'll investigate immediately. May I ask if you've had any communication with your daughter about this situation?" "A text message reporting she was very cold, which prompted my investigation. She downplayed the situation, which is typical of her. Olivia isn't one to complain." James made a quick decision. "Mr. Bennett, I'll personally look into this right now. I'll report back within 15 minutes." "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your prompt attention." As James hung up the phone, Kevin raised an eyebrow. "Problem. Potentially serious one. I need to check the cabin. Take the controls." "I have the aircraft," Kevin confirmed, following standard protocol for transfer of command. James removed his headset and left the cockpit, securing the door behind him. As a former military officer, he approached the situation with methodical precision. He would observe firsthand, gather facts, and then take appropriate action based on what he found. The first-class cabin was dimly lit, with most passengers either sleeping or watching movies on their personal screens. His experienced eyes immediately picked out the girl in 3A, a young black child huddled against the window with what appeared to be a man's suit jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The contrast was striking. Every other passenger in the premium cabin was comfortably nestled under identical blue Atlantic Airlines blankets. Only this child lacked one. James's military training had instilled in him a deep sense of fairness and integrity. Throughout his Air Force career, he'd witnessed the transformative power of leaders who held themselves and others accountable to clear ethical standards. He'd also seen the damage caused when bias was allowed to go unchecked, eroding unit cohesion and mission effectiveness. The corporate world sometimes operated under more ambiguous standards, prioritizing customer satisfaction and operational efficiency over absolute moral clarity. But in James's mind, some principles transcended context. Equal treatment of all people under his command, whether military personnel or airline passengers, was one of those non-negotiable values. He approached Michael, who was organizing items in the forward galley. "A word, please." Michael followed him to a more private corner, his expression wary. "What's up, Captain? The girl in 3A, why doesn't she have a blanket when everyone else does?" Michael's expression flickered with something discomfort, perhaps guilt. Vanessa handled the blanket distribution. She reported we ran short. James had been flying long enough to recognize evasion when he heard it. Is that so? Because according to our load manifest, this flight was stocked with 12 first-class blankets for 8 seats. Michael's gaze dropped. I'm not sure what happened then. James studied Michael's face, recognizing the internal conflict playing out there. He'd seen this before, the struggle between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. I think you do know what happened, he said quietly. And I need you to be straight with me right now. This isn't just about comfort items anymore. This could become a serious matter with implications for everyone involved. Michael hesitated, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Vanessa has certain ideas about who belongs in first class. He finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have intervened earlier. I gave the girl a blanket a few minutes ago, but I should have done it sooner. James nodded, appreciating the honesty, but noting the delay in taking corrective action. Thank you for being forthright. I'll need to speak with Vanessa now. Before Michael could respond, James moved through the cabin to where Vanessa was chatting with a male passenger in the last row of first class. Her smile vanished when she saw the captain. Vanessa, I need to speak with you now. In the galley, James didn't waste time. Why does the passenger in 3A not have a blanket? Vanessa's response came too quickly, too rehearsed. We ran out. It happens sometimes when the ground crew doesn't stock. James interrupted. I've already checked our manifest. We have more than enough blankets on board. Well, I looked everywhere and couldn't find enough, Vanessa insisted. Maybe they were miscounted, or... James moved to a storage compartment in the galley and opened it. Inside were at least 6 neatly folded blue blankets still in their plastic wrapping. He turned back to Vanessa, whose face had drained of color. Want to try again? Vanessa's expression hardened. That child was disruptive during boarding and meal service. I used my discretion. How exactly was she disruptive? James pressed his military bearing evident in his rigid posture and clipped tones. Vanessa faltered. She questioned procedures, demanded special treatment. Specifically, she kept asking for things. Water refills, temperature adjustment, special meal options. James had reviewed the manifest before leaving the cockpit. According to our records, she didn't request any special meal, and since when is asking for water considered disruptive? Vanessa's composure slipped further. Look, I've been flying these routes for 15 years. I know when someone doesn't fit the profile of our premium customers. The profile? James repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Realizing her mistake, Vanessa attempted to backtrack. I meant behavior profile, experience level. That child is not only a paying first-class passenger, but happens to be the daughter of Elijah Bennett, our senior vice president of global operations. The blood drained from Vanessa's face. What? How was I supposed to know that? You weren't. That's the point. You're supposed to treat every passenger with the same level of respect and service regardless of who they are or what they look like. James's voice remained controlled, but his disapproval was unmistakable. This isn't just a customer service issue anymore, Vanessa. This is discrimination, and it happened on my aircraft. James took a blanket from the compartment and a packet of hot chocolate from another drawer. Heat this up, he instructed Michael, handing him the beverage packet, and bring it to 3A immediately along with our most sincere apologies. To Vanessa, he said, stay in the galley until I return. We'll discuss this further after I've spoken with the passenger. 8 minutes had passed since Elijah Bennett's call. In those 8 minutes, Captain James Sullivan had confirmed a situation that violated both company policy and his personal ethics. The next 9 minutes would determine how history would remember this flight. As he walked back to the cockpit, James weighed his options. Company protocol suggested documenting the incident and addressing it upon landing. But his military training had taught him that addressing misconduct immediately and decisively was essential to maintaining order and respect. Allowing Vanessa to continue serving passengers after confirming discriminatory behavior would send a message that such conduct was tolerable, a message he refused to endorse. The decision crystallized in his mind. He would contact operations, request a diversion to Cleveland, and remove Vanessa from duty immediately. It would disrupt schedules, inconvenience passengers, and potentially create pushback from management concerned about costs. But some principles weren't negotiable even at 30,000 feet. James approached Olivia with the blanket, maintaining a friendly but professional demeanor to avoid drawing more attention to her. "I believe you requested this earlier," he said quietly, offering the blanket. "I apologize for the oversight." Olivia looked up with surprise, quickly wiping away traces of tears. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the blanket with hands that trembled slightly. James crouched beside her seat to bring himself to her eye level, speaking softly to maintain her privacy. "I want to personally apologize for your experience on our flight today. It falls far short of how Atlantic Airlines expects our passengers to be treated, and I'm taking steps to address it immediately." Olivia nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but visibly relieved to finally have a blanket. The passenger next to her, Thomas Wilson. James noted from the manifest review he'd done before leaving the cockpit, observed the interaction with a mixture of approval and lingering indignation on the girl's behalf. "Michael will bring you some hot chocolate in a moment," James continued. "Is there anything else you need to be comfortable for the remainder of our flight?" "No, sir. This is fine. Thank you." "You're very welcome." James hesitated, then added gently, "Your father sends his regards." Olivia's eyes widened in surprise. "He knows?" "Yes. He's why I'm here talking to you now." A complex mix of emotions crossed Olivia's face, relief, embarrassment, and something like disappointment. "I didn't want to bother him," she said quietly. "He has the merger to worry about." The simple statement revealed volumes about the young girl's character, her awareness of her father's responsibilities, her reluctance to be a burden. James felt a renewed surge of resolve to address the situation decisively. "Some things are more important than mergers," he said, giving her a reassuring smile before returning to the galley where Vanessa and Michael awaited. "I've made a decision," James informed them, his voice low but firm. "We're diverting to Cleveland Hopkins International. Vanessa, you'll be removed from duty pending a full investigation." "What?" Vanessa's face flushed with anger. "You're diverting the aircraft over a blanket. That's completely disproportionate." "This isn't about a blanket," James replied. "This is about discriminatory treatment of a passenger based on her race, which violates federal aviation regulations, company policy, and basic human decency." "You can't prove that was my motivation," Vanessa protested. "The evidence speaks for itself." "You deliberately skipped the only black passenger during blanket distribution, lied about supplies, and then stated they weren't for everyone when directly questioned. Multiple witnesses heard and observed your behavior." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, couldn't this be handled upon arrival in Boston? A diversion will affect all the passengers." "And allowing discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked affects our entire airline and industry," James countered. "I've already received authorization from headquarters for this action." Vanessa's expression shifted from indignation to calculation. "So this is happening because she's some executive's daughter, special treatment for connected people, while the rest of us get thrown under the bus." "No, this is happening because you denied service to a passenger based on her appearance. The fact that she happens to be Mr. Bennett's daughter simply means your behavior was discovered more quickly. Had you done this to any passenger, the outcome would be the same." This wasn't entirely true. James knew that, without Elijah Bennett's direct intervention, the incident might have been documented and addressed later, possibly with a customer service voucher and a note in Vanessa's file, rather than an immediate diversion. But the principle he stated was the standard he believed should apply regardless of the passenger's connections. "Michael, where do you stand in all this?" James asked, turning to the lead flight attendant. Michael hesitated, visibly conflicted. I observed differential treatment but didn't intervene early enough. I should have stepped in sooner. Yes, you should have, James agreed. Your failure to act will be part of the investigation, but for now I need you to... Where do you stand in all this? James asked, turning to the lead flight attendant. Michael hesitated, visibly conflicted. I observed differential treatment but didn't intervene early enough. I should have stepped in sooner. Yes, you should have, James agreed. Your failure to act will be part of the investigation, but for now I need you to continue serving the cabin professionally while I arrange our diversion. James returned to the cockpit where Kevin Martinez was maintaining their course toward Boston. What's the situation? Kevin asked as James settled back into his seat. Confirmed discrimination against a minor passenger. We're diverting to Cleveland to remove a flight attendant from duty. James picked up the radio to contact air traffic control as he brought Kevin up to speed on the situation. Within minutes, they had clearance for the diversion, and James activated the cabin announcement system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan speaking. I regret to inform you that we will be making an unscheduled landing in Cleveland due to a crew issue. We expect to be on the ground for approximately 1 hour while we address this matter. I apologize for the inconvenience and will provide more information as it becomes available. As he set the new course for Cleveland, James reflected on the core values that had guided his military and civilian career: integrity, service, and respect for every individual regardless of rank or background. Today, those values required him to take a stand even if it meant disrupting 200 passengers' travel plans. Some principles simply weren't negotiable. Kevin had been silently processing the information. You're doing the right thing, he finally said. I served with too many good people who were treated differently because of skin color. Not on our flight. James nodded appreciatively. In the 15 minutes since Elijah Bennett's call, he had confirmed the situation addressed the immediate comfort needs of the affected passenger, confronted the responsible crew member, and initiated a course of action that aligned with both company policy and his personal ethical standards. 9 minutes remained in the countdown that had begun when Elijah first noticed his daughter's text message. In those 9 remaining minutes, the implications of this decision would begin to ripple through the airline and beyond. The mood in the cabin shifted perceptibly after Captain Sullivan's announcement. Passengers who had been dozing jolted awake, checking their watches and exchanging concerned glances. Others removed headphones, suddenly alert to the unexpected development. The phrase "crew issue" sparked immediate speculation, with whispered theories spreading from row to row. In first class, Vanessa Reynolds stood rigidly by the galley, her face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed her growing anxiety. She had served on enough flights to know that unscheduled diversions for crew issues typically meant one thing: someone was about to be removed from the aircraft. James knew the diversion would create operational challenges, passenger compensation claims, and potential scrutiny from company leadership concerned about costs and efficiency metrics. But as the aircraft began its descent toward Cleveland, he felt a certainty that transcended those concerns. Some moments defined a person's character and values. This was one of them. The atmosphere in this cabin grew increasingly tense as Flight 2467 began its descent toward Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Vanessa Reynolds remained in the galley, her posture rigid, while Michael Foster moved through the cabin, attempting to maintain a semblance of normal service. When Michael approached Olivia's row, his professional smile couldn't mask his discomfort. "Can I get you anything else before we land?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas Wilson looked up from his phone. "I think you've done quite enough already." Michael flinched slightly at the rebuke, but maintained his composure. "I understand your frustration, sir. I apologize for the situation." Across the aisle, Elizabeth Parker fixed Michael with a penetrating gaze. "Young man, there's a significant difference between apologizing for the situation and taking personal responsibility for your role in it." Michael hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You're right. I should have intervened earlier." He turned to Olivia. "I'm truly sorry for not stepping in when I saw how you were being treated. That was wrong of me." Olivia looked up, surprised by the direct acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said simply. "Why didn't you?" Thomas asked bluntly. "You clearly saw what was happening." Michael considered his answer carefully. "I'd like to say it was complicated, but it wasn't. I was afraid of workplace conflict, afraid of being labeled difficult, afraid of jeopardizing my career." He glanced toward the galley where Vanessa stood. "We have a system where speaking up has consequences and staying silent is rewarded. It's not an excuse, but it's the reality many of us work in." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "That's how discrimination persists, not just through active bias, but through the silence of those who recognize it but choose the path of least resistance." "I know," Michael acknowledged, "and I have to live with that knowledge." As Michael moved on, Thomas leaned toward Olivia. "Are you doing okay? This is turning into quite a production." "I don't know," Olivia admitted. "I didn't want to cause all this trouble." "You didn't cause anything," Elizabeth interjected from across the aisle. "The flight attendant's actions and the captain's response are not your responsibility. You have every right to be treated with the same dignity and respect as any other passenger." "But what if Dad gets in trouble because of this?" Olivia asked, voicing a concern that had been growing since learning of her father's intervention. "He's overseeing a really important merger right now." "If standing up for his daughter puts him in trouble," Thomas replied, "then that would reflect poorly on the airline, not on your father." Olivia nodded, but still looked uncomfortable with being the center of so much attention. She had wrapped herself in the blanket Captain Sullivan had provided, but the comfort it offered was diminished by the knowledge that it had come only after intervention from the highest levels. In the cockpit, Captain Sullivan was coordinating with Cleveland operations, arranging for a replacement flight attendant, and ensuring the diversion would cause minimal disruption to the passenger's journey. He had also contacted Elijah Bennett to update him on the situation. "We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes, Sullivan informed Bennett. "I've arranged for the crew member to be escorted from the aircraft by airport police to avoid any further incidents." "Thank you, Captain," Elijah replied. "I appreciate your handling of this situation. Has anyone spoken directly to my daughter about what's happening?" "I've personally explained that we're addressing the service issues, but I haven't detailed the removal process to avoid causing her additional distress." "Good. The last thing she needs is to feel responsible for someone losing their job, even if that outcome is warranted. Please continue to use your discretion in communication with her." As the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet, Captain Sullivan made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. We apologize again for this unexpected stop. Upon arrival, we ask that all passengers remain seated while we address the crew matter that necessitated this diversion. We anticipate being on the ground for approximately 1 hour before continuing to Boston." The cabin remained unusually quiet as passengers processed this information. Most were annoyed by the delay, but increasingly curious about the crew matter, serious enough to warrant an unscheduled landing. In row 3, Olivia stared out the window at the approaching lights of Cleveland. This was not how she had imagined her first solo flight. What should have been an exciting precursor to her conference presentation had become a public spectacle. She was grateful for the support from fellow passengers and the captain's intervention, but part of her wished she could become invisible, could escape the stares and whispers that followed her throughout the cabin. The aircraft touched down smoothly and taxied to the gate. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, no one moved, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Captain Sullivan emerged from the cockpit, his uniform immaculate, his expression serious but composed. He was followed by 2 airport police officers and a woman in an Atlantic Airlines management uniform. Vanessa Reynolds emerged from the galley, her face pale. "Ms. Reynolds," Captain Sullivan said formally, "you're being removed from duty pending investigation into allegations of discriminatory treatment of a passenger. Please gather your personal belongings and accompany these officers." Vanessa's professional facade cracked. "This is outrageous. I've given 15 years to this airline, and I'm being publicly humiliated over a misunderstanding about blanket distribution." "This isn't about blankets," Sullivan replied calmly. "It's about treating all our passengers with equal dignity and respect, which is both company policy and my personal expectation as captain of this aircraft." Vanessa looked around wildly, seeking support from colleagues or passengers. Finding none, she switched tactics. "You know what this is really about. It's about connections and privilege. If she weren't an executive's daughter, we wouldn't be having this conversation. None of you cared about how many other passengers have been treated until someone with power complained." Her words landed with uncomfortable weight, containing a kernel of truth that made several passengers shift in their seats. Michael Foster stepped forward, his decision apparently made. "You're right, Vanessa," he said, his voice steady. "We wouldn't be having this conversation if Olivia's father hadn't intervened. And that's exactly the problem, the fact that it takes executive action to address something that should never happen to any passenger regardless of who they are or who their parents might be." Thomas Wilson spoke up from his seat. "For the record, several of us were addressing this situation before anyone knew about her father. Discrimination is discrimination regardless of who it's directed against." "Exactly," Elizabeth added. "I've witnessed similar incidents throughout my career, and the common thread isn't the status of the victim, but the silence of bystanders who could have intervened, but chose not to." The woman in the Atlantic Airlines uniform, Sarah Williams' regional manager, though she hadn't introduced herself yet, stepped forward. "Ms. Reynolds, we can discuss this further off the aircraft. Right now I need you to cooperate so we can minimize disruption to the passengers." Vanessa looked around the cabin, perhaps hoping for support, but found only avoided gazes or outright disapproval. Even Michael stood at a distance, unwilling to align himself with her position. "Fine," she said, finally gathering her purse from the galley. "But this isn't over." As Vanessa was escorted off the aircraft, Captain Sullivan turned to address the first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Atlantic Airlines, I want to sincerely apologize for the service failure you witnessed today. A replacement flight attendant is already boarding and we'll be on our way to Boston as quickly as possible." His eyes met Olivia's, briefly conveying a message of reassurance. Then he turned and walked back to the cockpit, his duty as commander requiring his attention returned to the operational aspects of continuing their journey. Sarah Williams remained in the cabin, approaching Olivia's seat. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Sarah Williams, regional manager for Atlantic Airlines. I want to personally apologize for your experience today and assure you that we're taking this matter extremely seriously." Olivia nodded, uncomfortable with the continued attention, but appreciating the acknowledgement. "Thank you. Is there anything you need for the remainder of your journey?" "No, thank you. I'm fine now." Sarah nodded, understanding the girl's desire to move past the incident, rather than prolonging the focus on her. "We'll be continuing to Boston shortly. Your father asked me to tell you he'll be waiting at the gate when we arrive." As Sarah moved through the cabin, checking on other passengers and managing the transition, a new flight attendant boarded Monica Jimenez, an experienced crew member quickly dispatched from the Cleveland base. Her warm, professional demeanor provided a stark contrast to Vanessa's earlier hostility as she efficiently prepared for the continuation of service to Boston. Elizabeth Parker leaned across the aisle toward Olivia. "What you just witnessed," she said quietly, "was accountability in action. It doesn't happen nearly often enough, but when it does, it reminds us that change is possible." Olivia considered this. Throughout the incident, she had felt powerless, a child at the mercy of adult authority figures who could choose to help or hurt her based on their own biases. But the swift, decisive response from Captain Sullivan demonstrated that there were systems and individuals willing to uphold principles of fairness and dignity. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate to resume its journey to Boston, Olivia felt something shift within her. Not just relief that the immediate situation had been resolved, but a deeper understanding of how individual choices and institutional responses intersect to either perpetuate or challenge patterns of discrimination. The accountability moment she had just witnessed wasn't just about a flight attendant being removed from duty. It was about the visible assertion that her dignity mattered, that she deserved the same respect and service as every other passenger regardless of her age or race. This lesson, unexpected and difficult though it was, would stay with her long after the details of the blanket incident had faded from memory. At 2:14 a.m., Atlantic Airlines Flight 2467 touched down at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Despite the late hour, the terminal was unusually active near their arrival gate. Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see multiple airline representatives in professional attire, 2 police officers, and ground crew standing by. Captain Sullivan's voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Cleveland. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. I apologize again for this unexpected stop and thank you for your patience." As the aircraft docked at the jet bridge, the cabin remained unusually quiet. Everyone seemed to sense the gravity of the situation unfolding. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved to stand. The forward cabin door opened and the 2 police officers boarded first, followed by Sarah Williams in her impeccable Atlantic Airlines executive uniform. Captain Sullivan emerged from the cockpit to meet them. "Captain Sullivan," one officer inquired. "Yes, that's me. We understand you have a situation requiring the removal of a crew member." Vanessa stepped forward, her professional demeanor completely abandoned. "This is discrimination," she declared loudly. "I'm being targeted because I enforced company policy against a disruptive passenger." Several first-class passengers immediately objected. "That's completely false," Thomas said, standing up. "The only disruptive person was this flight attendant who deliberately denied service to a child based on her race." "I can confirm that," added Elizabeth, waving her notebook. "I've documented everything that occurred with timestamps." Other passengers began recording the scene on their phones, despite Atlantic's policies discouraging in-flight photography. In the digital age, moments of public confrontation rarely remained private. Sarah Williams stepped forward. "I'm Sarah Williams, Regional Manager for Atlantic Airlines. I'd like to speak with Ms. Reynolds privately. I want these passengers removed too," Vanessa insisted, pointing at Thomas and several others who had spoken up. "They've been hostile and threatening throughout the flight." One of the officers turned to Captain Sullivan. "Is that accurate, sir?" "No," James replied firmly. "Based on my investigation and direct observation, multiple passengers intervened appropriately when they witnessed discriminatory treatment of a minor. Their behavior has been reasonable given the circumstances." Vanessa's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You can't do this. I know my rights. I'll sue the airline for wrongful termination." "Ms. Reynolds," Sarah said quietly, "this conversation would be better continued off the aircraft. The other passengers have been delayed enough." The officers flanked Vanessa, not touching her, but clearly prepared to escort her if necessary. "Ma'am, please come with us," one said. For a moment it seemed Vanessa might refuse, but then her shoulders slumped in defeat. As she gathered her personal belongings, she looked directly at Olivia, her expression a complex mix of resentment and something that might have been regret. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, her voice lower now. 15 years of perfect service records and one complaint from the right person erases everything." Olivia, caught off guard by being directly addressed, didn't respond, but Thomas Wilson did. "It wasn't one complaint," he said firmly. "It was a pattern of behavior that multiple passengers witnessed and that you yourself admitted to when you said blankets aren't for everyone." Vanessa's gaze lingered on Olivia for another moment before she turned and followed the officers off the aircraft, Sarah Williams close behind. As they disappeared down the jet bridge, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the cabin. Michael, looking visibly relieved yet professionally composed, approached the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire Atlantic Airlines team, I want to sincerely apologize for tonight's disruption and for the inappropriate service some of you may have witnessed. We're currently bringing a replacement flight attendant on board, and we should be departing for Boston within the hour. Thank you for your patience and understanding." During the delay, Michael moved through the cabin, personally checking on passengers and offering refreshments. When he reached Olivia's row, he crouched beside her seat. "Miss Bennett, I want to personally apologize for not intervening earlier when I saw how you were being treated," he said quietly. "I failed in my duty as lead flight attendant, and there's no excuse for that. I hope you can forgive me." Olivia nodded, still uncomfortable with the attention but appreciating his sincerity. "It's okay." "It's not okay," Michael replied, "but I promise you'll have excellent service for the remainder of your journey." "Why did she do it?" Olivia asked suddenly. "Was it really just because of how I look?" Michael considered the question carefully. "It's complicated. Vanessa has certain ideas about who belongs in premium spaces. She grew up with very little, worked her way into what she considers an elite position, and somewhere along the way started viewing herself as a gatekeeper rather than a service provider. When she was passed over for promotion a few years ago in favor of a younger black colleague, it reinforced her worldview that certain people are getting special treatment." "That's not an excuse," Thomas interjected. "No, it's not," Michael agreed. "Just context. Bias often has deep roots, but understanding where it comes from doesn't justify its expression, especially toward a child." True to his word, Michael ensured that Olivia received attentive, respectful service the same level provided to every other passenger for the remainder of the flight. As promised, a replacement flight attendant, Monica Jimenez, boarded within 45 minutes. Before departing, Cleveland Captain Sullivan made a brief appearance in the first-class cabin, stopping at Olivia's seat. "Miss Bennett, I wanted to check that you're comfortable for the remainder of our journey to Boston." "Yes, sir. Thank you," Olivia replied. "Excellent. We should have you in Boston within the hour." He hesitated, then added, "I understand you're attending a science conference." Olivia's eyes brightened slightly. "Yes, the International Youth Climate Conference. I'm presenting my research on urban carbon capture methods." James smiled. "That sounds fascinating. My daughter is interested in environmental science, too." He lowered his voice slightly. "And for what it's worth, I think you handled a very difficult situation with remarkable grace tonight. That takes real strength of character." As Captain Sullivan returned to the cockpit and the aircraft pushed back from the gate to resume its journey to Boston, Olivia felt a complex mix of emotions. The humiliation of the blanket incident still stung, but there was also a new awareness of the allies who had spoken up on her behalf and the swift, decisive action taken once the discrimination was exposed. Perhaps most importantly, she had maintained her dignity throughout the ordeal, just as her father had taught her. The conference and her presentation still awaited, and despite everything, she was determined to shine there just as brightly as she had at the national competition. Thomas Wilson, who had been quiet during the removal process, turned to Olivia. "I travel a lot for business, and I've seen my share of poor service. But what happened tonight was different. It was wrong on a fundamental level. I'm impressed by how you handled yourself." "My dad always says dignity isn't something others can take from you unless you let them," Olivia replied. "Your dad sounds like a wise man." "He is." Olivia smiled slightly, thinking of her father waiting in Boston, unaware that she knew of his intervention. As Flight 2467 climbed back to cruising altitude, the cabin atmosphere had transformed. What had been a space of tension and division now felt almost communal, as if the passengers had shared an important experience that transcended the usual anonymity of air travel. For Olivia, the remainder of the journey passed in relative peace, the warmth of her blanket now a simple comfort rather than a symbol of exclusion. By the time the aircraft began its final approach to Boston, she had returned to reviewing her presentation, focused once more on the purpose of her journey representing young American scientists on an international stage. In the wake of accountability, there was room once again for aspiration. Atlantic Airlines Flight 2467 touched down at Boston. Logan International Airport at 4:17 a.m., more than 3 hours behind schedule. Exhausted passengers blinked at the harsh fluorescent lighting as they filed through the jet bridge into the terminal. Most were focused on collecting their luggage and finding transportation to their hotels for what remained of the night. Olivia Bennett stepped into the terminal, expecting to see a driver holding a sign with her name, the car service her father had arranged. Instead, she was met with an unexpected sight, a cluster of news crews with cameras and microphones, and at their center, Elijah Bennett himself. "Dad," Olivia called out in surprise. Elijah turned at the sound of her voice, his normally composed executive demeanor giving way to the relief of a worried father. He strode toward her arms, outstretched, and enveloped her in a tight embrace. "Liv," he murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry about what happened." "You didn't have to come early," she said, though she clung to him with equal intensity. "Yes, I did." Elijah pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay now," she answered, then added with a hint of reproach, "But you shouldn't have called the captain. I could have handled it." Elijah was taken aback by her reaction. "Liv, no one should have to handle discrimination, especially not a child traveling alone." "I'm not just a child," she replied, her voice low but firm. "I'm a scientist presenting at an international conference. I need to learn to handle difficult situations on my own." Their conversation was interrupted as reporters noticed them and moved closer, cameras flashing and questions overlapping. "Mr. Bennett, can you confirm that your daughter was racially profiled on an Atlantic flight tonight? Is it true a flight attendant was removed mid-flight for discrimination? Olivia, how do you feel about what happened?" Elijah raised a hand, his executive authority instantly commanding silence. "My daughter has had a long, difficult night and needs rest before her conference presentation tomorrow. I'll make a brief statement, but then we're leaving, and I expect you to respect our privacy." The reporters fell silent, cameras still rolling. "Tonight, my daughter experienced discrimination while traveling as an unaccompanied minor on our airline." Elijah began, his voice measured but resonant with controlled emotion. "What happened reflects a deep-rooted issue that extends far beyond a single flight attendant or a single incident. It reveals how implicit bias can manifest in everyday interactions, causing harm to innocent people. In this case, a child traveling alone to represent young American scientists at an international conference." He continued, "I'm speaking not just as an airline executive, but as a father. The fact that my position gave me the ability to intervene is a privilege that most parents of color don't have when their children face similar treatment. That reality requires serious reflection and action from all of us in positions of authority." Elijah put his arm around Olivia's shoulders. "Atlantic Airlines has begun a full investigation, and I've recused myself from direct involvement to avoid any conflict of interest. That's all I'll say for now. Thank you." As Elijah guided Olivia toward the exit, ignoring further questions from reporters, Thomas Wilson approached them. "Mr. Bennett, I was seated next to Olivia on the flight. I just wanted to say she handled herself with incredible poise tonight. You should be very proud." "Thank you," Elijah replied, shaking Thomas's hand. "And thank you for looking out for her." "No thanks needed. It was the right thing to do." Thomas handed Elijah a business card. "I'm the education director at the Wilson Foundation. If there's ever anything we can do to support Olivia's scientific pursuits, please let me know." As they walked toward the parking area, Olivia remained unusually quiet. Elijah glanced at her with concern. "What's on your mind, Liv?" Did you get in trouble? She asked abruptly. For using your position to help me. Elijah hesitated, unsure how much to share about Richard Dalton's reaction and the potential professional consequences he might face. There have been some questions about proper procedure, he admitted carefully, but nothing I can't handle. So you did get in trouble? Olivia concluded, her expression troubled. Because of me. Not because of you, Elijah corrected firmly. Because of my choice to address discrimination directly rather than letting it go unaddressed. That was my decision and one I'd make again without hesitation. But if I hadn't texted you... Liv, stop. Elijah halted, turning to face his daughter fully. What happened tonight wasn't your fault. Not the discrimination you faced, not my decision to intervene, not any potential fallout. The responsibility lies with those who discriminated and with the systems that allowed it to happen. By the time they reached their hotel, video clips from the Cleveland confrontation were already circulating on social media. Passengers had recorded Vanessa's removal from the aircraft and her accusations against disruptive passengers, along with the contradicting statements from other travelers. One passenger had even captured Michael's public apology to Olivia, though her face was thankfully not clearly visible in the footage. The hashtag #BlanketsAre for everyone began trending nationally by sunrise, becoming a rallying cry against everyday discrimination. Social media users shared their own experiences of differential treatment in commercial settings, particularly during travel. Within hours, the story had expanded far beyond a single incident on one flight, sparking a broader conversation about race privilege and accountability in customer service environments. As dawn broke over Boston Atlantic Airlines' stock price dipped 3% in pre-market trading as investors anticipated public relations damage. The corporate communications team convened an emergency meeting to craft a response that would address the incident without creating additional liability. The initial statement, released at 8:00 Eastern Time, acknowledged a serious service failure and promised appropriate action, but many viewed it as insufficient given the circumstances. Meanwhile, Olivia tried to focus on finalizing her conference presentation. Seated at the desk in her hotel room, she reviewed her slides while Elijah handled a steady stream of calls, carefully screening media requests and messages of support that were pouring in. "Dad," she asked during a brief lull, "is this going to hurt your job?" Elijah set down his phone and turned to his daughter. "Don't worry about my job, Liv. I'm more concerned about how this is affecting you." "I'm okay," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "But all these cameras and reporters, what if they show up at the conference? I just want to present my research like everyone else." "I understand." Elijah nodded. "I've already spoken with the conference organizers. They're increasing security and have a plan to shield student presenters from any media disruption." He hesitated, then added, "But I want you to know that you have choices here. If you'd prefer to skip the conference and go home, that's completely fine." "No," Olivia said firmly, a flash of her mother's determination crossing her face. "I earned my place there. I'm going to present my research." Elijah smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's my girl." As they prepared for the conference, Elijah received a text from Richard Dalton. "Emergency Executive Committee meeting at 4 p.m. Your presence required. Video conference available." The message concluded with a formal tone that suggested this would not be a friendly discussion. Elijah responded simply, "Will attend via video. Supporting my daughter's conference presentation until 5 p.m. He pocketed his phone without sharing this development with Olivia. Today was about her achievement, not his professional challenges. Whatever disciplinary action awaited him could wait until her moment in the spotlight had passed. By mid-morning, the story had reached Capitol Hill. Several members of the Congressional Black Caucus called for hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation. The Department of Transportation announced it would review complaints data across all major carriers to identify patterns of bias in customer service incidents. While the media storm raged outside within their hotel suite, father and daughter prepared for what each privately considered the more important challenge of the day: Olivia's scientific presentation and the executive committee meeting that could determine Elijah's professional future. Both were determined that dignity, not discrimination, would define this day's legacy. The Boston Convention and Exhibition Center buzzed with activity as attendees from around the world gathered for the International Youth Climate Conference. Security had been noticeably enhanced. Additional personnel stationed at entrances' credentials checked more rigorously. Media cordoned to specific areas. The organizers had clearly prepared for the increased attention surrounding Olivia Bennett's presentation. Inside the main presentation hall, Olivia waited backstage, reviewing her notes one final time. The magnitude of the moment wasn't lost on her. Beyond presenting her research, she had become an unwitting symbol in a national conversation about race, privilege, and belonging. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her slides. 5 minutes, Miss Bennett, a conference coordinator informed her. Olivia nodded, then glanced at her father, who stood nearby with Thomas Wilson and Elizabeth Parker. Elijah gave her an encouraging smile. "You've got this, Liv." "What if they're not here for the science?" she whispered, voicing the fear that had been growing since seeing the media presence. "What if they just want to see the girl from the plane?" "Then show them who you really are," Elijah replied. "A brilliant young scientist whose work matters." When her name was announced, Olivia walked onto the stage with measured steps. Her chin lifted slightly, the posture of dignified confidence Elijah had taught her since childhood. The audience, larger than anticipated, greeted her with thunderous applause that continued far longer than for previous presenters. Some rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation before she had spoken a single word. Olivia waited for the applause to subside, then addressed the audience with remarkable poise for a 12-year-old. "Thank you for that warm welcome," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm here today to present my research on carbon capture optimization in urban green spaces. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Many of you are here because you've heard about what happened on my flight to Boston. While I appreciate your support, I want to shift our focus to what really matters: the climate science that brought us all together today." With that clear redirection, Olivia launched into her presentation. Her research was genuinely groundbreaking, a novel approach to measuring and enhancing carbon sequestration in city parks and green roofs that could significantly increase urban environments' contribution to climate change mitigation. As she explained her methodology and findings, her initial nervousness gave way to the confident expertise of someone deeply passionate about their work. From the front row, Elijah watched with immense pride. Despite everything she had endured, Olivia's scientific brilliance shone through undimmed. Beside him, Thomas nodded appreciatively at particularly innovative aspects of her research, while Elizabeth beamed like a proud grandmother. When Olivia concluded her presentation, the audience rose as one in a standing ovation that echoed throughout the hall. Questions from fellow scientists and climate experts followed, all focused respectfully on her research rather than the incident that had brought media attention. "Your methodology for calculating carbon sequestration rates in diverse urban plantings is fascinating," commented Dr. Amara Lee, a leading environmental scientist. "Have you considered applying this approach to vertical garden systems on high-rise buildings?" Olivia's face lit up at the substantive question. "Actually, yes. My next phase of research will include vertical installations and their potential for enhanced absorption rates in dense urban environments." For the next 15 minutes, Olivia engaged in deep scientific discussion with some of the field's most respected researchers, a 12-year-old holding her own among PhDs and veteran climate scientists. This was the moment she had prepared for the recognition of her work rather than her identity or experiences. As the session ended and Olivia left the stage, Atlantic Airlines CEO Jackson Thomas approached Elijah. He had flown in specifically for the presentation. "Your daughter is remarkable," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Her composure under these circumstances speaks volumes about her character and your parenting." "Thank you," Elijah replied. "But this isn't just about Olivia. It's about addressing the conditions that made her experience possible in the first place." Thomas nodded soberly. "Agreed. That's why I wanted to make this announcement in person." He handed Elijah a press release scheduled for distribution that afternoon. "We're establishing the Passenger Equity Initiative with independent oversight and real enforcement authority. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd like Olivia to serve as our inaugural youth advisor, but only if she feels comfortable taking on that role." As they discussed the details, Captain James Sullivan and several crew members in full Atlantic Airlines uniforms entered the convention center. They had flown in specifically to attend Olivia's presentation as a show of solidarity. "We wanted her to see that many of us in the company stand for something better," James explained when Elijah greeted him. "And we're serious about fundamental change." He described the pilot advocacy group that had formed in response to the incident, now with members from multiple airlines committed to ensuring equitable treatment in the skies. "It's not about blankets," Sullivan said earnestly. "It's about dignity and respect. Every passenger deserves that regardless of who they are." Meanwhile, a different kind of confrontation was unfolding near the convention center entrance. Richard Dalton had unexpectedly arrived in Boston and was attempting to hold an impromptu press conference challenging the narrative around the blanket incident. While Atlantic Airlines takes all allegations of discrimination seriously, he told the gathered reporters, "We also believe in due process for our employees and proper investigative procedures before taking drastic actions." His comments were creating an uncomfortable counterpoint to the official company position, suggesting internal division at the highest levels. When asked directly about Elijah Bennett's actions, Dalton's response was pointed. "Executives are expected to follow the same protocols as all employees, perhaps even more scrupulously given their visibility and influence. The investigation into all aspects of this incident remains ongoing." Word of Dalton's unauthorized press conference quickly reached Jackson Thomas, who immediately called Alexandra Rodriguez. Within 20 minutes, Dalton was pulled away by a PR representative and the impromptu briefing terminated. Later that afternoon, as attendees mingled during a conference reception, Elizabeth Parker approached Olivia with an unexpected announcement. "I've decided to establish the Parker Foundation for Youth Scientific Advancement," she revealed. "My late husband left me quite comfortable, and I've been looking for a meaningful way to direct those resources. Your courage and brilliance have inspired me to focus on supporting young scientists from underrepresented backgrounds." Olivia was momentarily speechless. "Ms. Parker, that's amazing." "Elizabeth, please," the older woman corrected gently. "And it's the least I can do. I spent decades fighting discrimination in courtrooms, but I've come to believe that supporting bright young minds like yours may ultimately do more to change entrenched patterns." Not to be outdone, Thomas Wilson announced that his foundation would establish the Olivia Bennett Scholarship Fund, providing financial support and mentorship for young climate scientists from minority communities. "We've already secured initial funding for 10 full scholarships," he told Olivia and Elijah. "Your experience highlighted exactly why this work matters. We lose too many brilliant minds when barriers of bias make them feel they don't belong in these spaces." As the evening wound down, Olivia found a quiet moment with her father away from the continuing buzz of conversation and congratulations. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "all these people want to create programs and foundations because of what happened to me, but I'm just one person who had a bad experience on a plane. It seems, I don't know, disproportionate." Elijah considered her words carefully. "What happened to you was a visible manifestation of what happens to countless others without witnesses or intervention. You're not just one person in this context, you're representative of a pattern that needs addressing. The response isn't disproportionate to the problem, even if it might feel that way to your experience alone." "I guess," Olivia acknowledged, "I just don't want to be defined by this forever. I want to be known for my science, not for being denied a blanket." You will be, Elijah assured her. Today proved that. Your research stood on its own merits regardless of what brought some of the audience members to the hall. As they prepared to leave, Jackson Thomas approached with a concerned expression. Elijah, I need to speak with you privately. There have been some developments with Richard Dalton's unauthorized comments to the press. While Elijah stepped aside for this conversation, Elizabeth engaged Olivia in a discussion of her future research plans, tactfully diverting her attention from the corporate politics playing out nearby. The board has called an emergency session, Thomas informed Elijah quietly. Dalton's actions today, directly contradicting our official position, have created a significant problem. We need you back in Chicago tomorrow. I understand, Elijah replied, mentally recalculating their return plans. Is my position still secure? Thomas's expression was grave. I can't make guarantees, Elijah. This has become more complicated than any of us anticipated. There are board members who share Dalton's concerns about precedent and procedure. I see, Elijah said simply. Then I'll prepare accordingly. The professional risk he had accepted when making that first call to Captain Sullivan was now materializing into concrete consequences. As he rejoined Olivia, he maintained a calm demeanor, unwilling to burden her with these developments on what should be a day of triumph. Ready to head back to the hotel? He asked, smiling naturally despite the weight of uncertainty now pressing on his shoulders. Yes, Olivia replied, yawning. It's been a really long day. Indeed, it had a day that began with scientific triumph, but was ending with the looming possibility that standing up for his daughter's dignity might cost Elijah Bennett the career he had spent decades building. 6 months after the blanket incident, Olivia Bennett stood before a group of middle school girls at the newly established Bennett Parker STEM Center in Chicago's South Side. The renovated space, once an abandoned community center, now bustled with activity as young scientists conducted experiments, built robots, and explored environmental data with state-of-the-art equipment. The most important discovery I've made this year, Olivia told the attentive circle of girls, isn't about carbon capture or climate science at all. It's about how small moments of injustice reveal larger patterns and how small acts of courage can help change those patterns. The girls nodded, many of them already familiar with Olivia's story through news coverage and social media. What they didn't know was how profoundly that experience had transformed Olivia herself. In the months following the flight to Boston, Olivia had undergone a remarkable evolution. The quiet, studious girl who had tried to shrink into her seat when denied a blanket had emerged as a poised young leader who could speak with authority about both scientific innovation and social justice. She had discovered a voice that extended beyond data and research methodologies, a voice that connected her scientific brilliance with her lived experience, navigating spaces that weren't designed with her in mind. Yet this growth hadn't come without struggles. Some days Olivia resented the attention that had been thrust upon her. She had never asked to become a symbol or to have her name attached to corporate initiatives and foundation scholarships. Sometimes I just want to be Olivia the scientist, she had confessed to her father one night after a particularly intense media interview. Not Olivia the blanket girl, not Olivia the diversity mascot. Just me. Elijah had nodded in understanding. The world rarely gives us the luxury of being just one thing, especially when we look like us. But you get to decide which aspects of your experience you emphasize and when. This tension between embracing her role as an unintended symbol of dignity and resistance and maintaining her core identity as a young scientist had become a central theme of Olivia's personal development. Some days, she leaned into the advocacy work, speaking to corporate groups about inclusive practices. Other days, she focused exclusively on her expanding carbon capture research, refusing all interview requests. Her carbon capture research had expanded from a single-city pilot to a multi-location study implemented in Chicago, Boston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Environmental agencies were incorporating her methodology into urban planning guidelines, and several major cities had launched green space initiatives directly inspired by her work. What had begun as a school science project now had real-world impact on urban sustainability efforts. More surprising was how Olivia had grown into her unexpected role as a symbol of dignity and resilience. Initially uncomfortable with the attention surrounding the incident, she had gradually recognized the power of her story to create openings for important conversations about bias and belonging. "When something unfair happens to you," she explained to the girls, carefully measuring her words, "you have choices about how to respond. You can shrink yourself to avoid more unfairness. You can get angry and fight back directly. Or you can stand tall, speak truth, and focus on creating change that lasts beyond that moment." One girl raised her hand. "Weren't you scared when all those people were looking at you on the plane?" Olivia nodded. "I was terrified and humiliated. I just wanted to disappear." She paused, thinking back to that cold cabin, to the tears she had tried to hide. "But I remembered what my parents always taught me, that my dignity isn't something others can take away unless I let them." Another girl asked, "Do you hate that flight attendant now?" "No," Olivia answered thoughtfully. "I don't hate her. I feel sad that she carried so much bias that it made her treat a child badly. And I hope that what happened helps her learn and grow, just like it helped me learn and grow." This response reflected another dimension of Olivia's development, her capacity to hold complexity. She had moved beyond seeing the incident in simple terms of victim and villain, recognizing instead the interwoven factors that shaped individual behavior within larger structural patterns. What the girls couldn't see was how this public growth masked a more private struggle. Olivia had experienced nightmares in the weeks following the incident, dreams where she was trapped on an endless flight, always cold, always overlooked. She had developed a habit of overpacking for trips, always bringing extra sweaters and blankets, just in case. And she still flinched sometimes when boarding aircraft, bracing herself unconsciously for scrutiny or rejection. These private challenges made her public poise all the more remarkable. They were part of what made her message resonate so authentically with the girls looking up to her, the understanding that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. After the session at the STEM Center, Elijah picked Olivia up in the family car rather than his executive sedan, one of many subtle adjustments they'd made to maintain normalcy amid the continuing attention. As they drove home, Elijah noticed his daughter gazing thoughtfully out the window. "Penny for your thoughts, Liv." "I was thinking about Mom," Olivia replied softly. "About what she would say about everything that's happened." Elijah swallowed hard. Even 4 years after Claire's death, these moments still caught him unprepared, the grief rising swift and sharp. "What do you think she would say?" Olivia considered this. "I think she'd be proud of how we handled it. Not just standing up when something wrong happened, but using that moment to help make things better for other people too." Elijah nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "I think you're right." "And," Olivia added with the hint of a smile, "she'd probably say something scientific about how small disturbances in stable systems can create unexpected chain reactions." Elijah laughed, the tension breaking. "That sounds exactly like her." His own journey through this period had been equally complex. The formal review of his actions had ultimately resulted in a written reprimand in his personnel file, a relatively mild consequence, thanks largely to Alexandra Rodriguez's intervention with the board. Richard Dalton had been reassigned to oversee European operations, a lateral move that many interpreted as a gentle sidelining after his unauthorized press comments had created additional controversy. Elijah now led the Passenger Equity Initiative, though not without ongoing resistance from certain corners of the organization. Some colleagues viewed him with newfound respect for his principled stand. Others maintained a wary distance, uncertain how his willingness to challenge corporate hierarchy might affect their own advancement if they became too closely associated with him. When they arrived home, a package awaited on their doorstep. Inside was a handmade quilt with a note from Elizabeth Parker. to remind you that warmth and protection should be available to everyone. Your courage has inspired many, including this old attorney who thought her fighting days were behind her. The quilt was beautiful deep blues and greens with mathematical patterns that echoed Olivia's research on optimal spatial arrangements for carbon capture. But more meaningful than the gift itself was the network of relationships. It represented connections formed through a shared commitment to dignity and justice that transcended differences in age, background, and experience. Later that week, Olivia received an email from a 12-year-old girl in Detroit who had seen her conference presentation online. "You made me think I could be a scientist too, even though there aren't any black scientists at my school," the message read. "I started a project about water quality in our neighborhood, and my teacher says it's really good." This was happening more frequently now, young people, especially girls of color, reaching out to share how Olivia's example had inspired their own scientific explorations. Each message reinforced Olivia's understanding that representation mattered not just as an abstract principle, but as a practical catalyst for expanding possibilities. 1 year after Flight 2467, Atlantic Airlines invited Olivia to speak at the unveiling of their newly implemented Olivia Standard customer service protocols. Standing at the podium, addressing an audience of airline executives, employees, and media representatives, she delivered a message that reflected her growth from hesitant passenger to confident advocate. "A year ago, I was denied a blanket because someone decided I didn't belong in first class," she began. "Today, I'm helping to ensure that no one else has that experience, not because I'm special, but because dignity shouldn't depend on who your parents are or what you look like." She continued, "The most important question isn't whether bias exists, we know it does. The question is what we do when we encounter it. Do we look away? Do we accept it as normal? Or do we stand up, speak truth, and work together to create systems where everyone is treated with equal respect?" As Olivia concluded her remarks, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for her words, but for the remarkable journey they represented. From a child shivering in an airplane seat to a young leader helping to reshape an industry's approach to equity and inclusion, Olivia's growth embodied the possibility of transformation at both personal and institutional levels. That evening, Elijah found Olivia in their home office working on a new research proposal about the intersection of environmental justice and urban planning. "Proud of you, Liv," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Olivia looked up from her computer. "For the speech, for everything, for being exactly who you are." She smiled a real smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her face. "I'm still figuring out who that is." "That's the adventure," Elijah replied, "and I can't wait to see where it takes you next." In that moment, the blanket incident seemed very far away, not forgotten but integrated into a larger story of growth, purpose, and possibility that continued to unfold with each new day. 1 year after Flight 2467, Olivia Bennett approached the boarding gate at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. This time, she wasn't nervous. This time, she knew exactly what to expect. Her father stood beside her, though he wasn't accompanying her on the flight. Olivia had insisted on traveling alone again, a deliberate choice to reclaim the experience that had been tainted by discrimination 12 months earlier. "You're sure about this?" Elijah asked, his protective instinct still strong despite all they had been through. Olivia nodded. "I'm sure." At 13 now, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that had deepened through the challenges and triumphs of the past year. Her research on urban carbon capture had been published in a prestigious scientific journal, unprecedented for someone her age. The STEM program she had helped develop at the Bennett Parker Center was now serving over 300 young people from Chicago's South Side. And most significantly, the Olivia Standard for equitable treatment had been adopted by airlines across the country, changing the travel experience for countless passengers. As they reached the priority boarding lane, Olivia handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a young woman with a warm smile who scanned it without a second glance at Olivia's race or age. "Have a wonderful flight, Miss Bennett," she said, returning the document. "We're honored to have you flying with us today." Elijah embraced his daughter. "Call me when you land." "I will," Olivia promised. "And Dad, thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me that dignity isn't negotiable, for showing me how to stand up for what's right without losing myself in anger. For everything." Elijah swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. "That's what parents are supposed to do." Olivia smiled. "Not all of them do it as well as you." With a final wave, she walked down the jet bridge toward the waiting aircraft. Elijah watched until she disappeared from view, marveling at the remarkable young woman his daughter had become, not despite the challenges she had faced, but partly because of how she had chosen to face them. Aboard the aircraft, Olivia was greeted by a flight attendant who showed no surprise at seeing a young black girl in first class. "Welcome aboard, Miss Bennett. Your seat is 3A on the right." As Olivia settled into her window seat, the same position she had occupied on that fateful flight, she noticed something. The aircraft type was the same. The seat configuration was identical. Even the flight number was similar. But the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The cabin was warm and welcoming. The crew moved through the space with genuine professional courtesy that extended equally to all passengers. There was no subtle scrutiny, no implied questioning of whether she belonged. As the boarding process continued, Olivia noticed the captain emerging from the cockpit to speak with the lead flight attendant. With a jolt of recognition, she realized it was Captain James Sullivan, the same pilot who had diverted Flight 2467 to Cleveland after confirming the discrimination she had experienced. Captain Sullivan spotted her as well, and after finishing his conversation with the flight attendant, he approached her seat. "Miss Bennett," he said with a warm smile, "it's good to see you again under better circumstances." "You too, Captain Sullivan. I thought you might like to know the pilot advocacy group we formed after your flight now has over 800 members across 12 airlines. We're changing the culture from the cockpit to the cabin." "That's amazing," Olivia replied, genuinely impressed by how far the ripples from that single incident had spread. "It is," Sullivan agreed. "But the most important changes are the ones passengers never have to notice because they're being treated with equal dignity from the start." As Captain Sullivan returned to the cockpit, the lead flight attendant began the blanket and pillow distribution. Olivia watched as she moved methodically through the cabin, offering the items to each passenger in turn. When she reached row 3, she smiled warmly at Olivia. "Would you like a blanket and pillow, Miss Bennett?" "Yes, please." Olivia responded, accepting the items with a simple, "Thank you." No drama, no special attention, no differential treatment of any kind, just the same professional courtesy extended to every other passenger. In that ordinary moment of equal service, Olivia felt the completion of a circle that had begun with exclusion and ended with belonging. As the aircraft lifted into the clouds, Olivia unfolded her blanket, the same Atlantic Airlines blue that had been withheld from her a year earlier. Now it was simply a comfort item, no longer a symbol of discrimination. She wrapped it around her shoulders, appreciating its warmth, not as a hard-won right, but as a standard amenity provided to all first-class passengers without question or qualification. Outside her window, the Chicago skyline receded, giving way to the vast landscape of America, stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere in that landscape, thousands of other travelers were boarding flights, checking into hotels, entering restaurants and stores, each of them deserving the same dignity and respect that had been initially denied to Olivia. Many would now receive it not because of who they were or who their parents were, but because one young girl's experience had catalyzed changes that transformed how entire industries approached customer service equity. Olivia opened her tablet to review her presentation for the International Youth Climate Leadership Summit, where she would be delivering the keynote address. Her research had expanded significantly over the past year, but her fundamental message remained the same. Small, thoughtful interventions could create meaningful change in complex systems, whether environmental or social. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the temperature in the cabin is currently 72 degrees. If you need any assistance adjusting your personal air vent or would like an additional blanket, please don't hesitate to ask any member of our cabin crew who are here to ensure every passenger's comfort and dignity throughout our journey together." Olivia smiled at the deliberate choice of words, a subtle acknowledgement of how far they had come. The flight attendant approached with a beverage tray. "What would you like to drink, Miss Bennett?" "Apple juice, please," Olivia replied. As the attendant poured the juice, Olivia noticed her name tag, Monica Jimenez, the same flight attendant who had replaced Vanessa Reynolds after the diversion to Cleveland. Monica clearly recognized Olivia as well, but treated her with the same professional courtesy she extended to every passenger. "Enjoying your flight?" Monica asked as she handed Olivia the drink. "Very much," Olivia replied. "The temperature is perfect." Monica smiled, understanding the significance of that simple statement. "I'm glad to hear it. That's exactly how it should be for everyone." As Monica moved on to the next passenger, Olivia sipped her juice and gazed out the window at the clouds below. The temperature in the cabin was indeed perfect now, not just in terms of physical comfort, but in the more profound sense of creating an environment where everyone could feel equally valued, equally welcomed, equally human. That, in the end, was the true meaning of warmth. Not just the absence of cold, but the presence of dignity that made every space a place where people could thrive. And that was a standard worth upholding, one passenger, one flight, one day at a time. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage, dignity, and positive change to light. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that small acts of